Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a absolutely chest-pounding, nail-biting adventure by the wonderful mind of our good friend Wayne Harbison. And this one's been a long time in the works. Wayne must have passed this over to me during mid-September last year, and I kept pushing it back and ploughing on with the Hunter's Hunted storyline, and of course the shadows over Mobile Bay. And if anything is to go by with those two incredible pieces, then I'm sure this will be just as good. As ever though, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, why not hashtag TeamFEAR. On a personal note, a big thank you Wayne for your personal guidance, your friendship, your ear of counsel at times when I'm stressed out and pulling my hair out, buddy. I really appreciate the fact that I can come to you for a quick 5 seconds of reassurance. And of course your patience in letting me get this story out when I felt the time was right. You wouldn't believe the amount of writers who get naggy and aggy when I don't put their content out as soon as they want it. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Feline Factor, the Vampire's Daughter. Let's get straight into that. Acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge and thank John Red Rum Morris III, who introduced me to the whole pulp genre. Thanks, pal. Get it? There is no more intrepid explorer than a kitten. Jules Chamfleury. Chapter 1. Okay, I knew this day would eventually come. I've known exactly who and what I am for the last 5 years or so. I'm a mistake, a clone that was never supposed to happen, but did. I'm not angry about that. Unfortunately, my brother Trey, from whom I was cloned, isn't too angry about it either. But I also know that I upset the balance, the agreement Our Lady made with the rest of the Elderkin about how many of us are supposed to be on Earth at the same time. That's why Dad sort of retired. And with him out of the official action, then I could at least be allowed to grow up enough to be ready for whatever arrangements the Keeper of Cats made about my disposition. I'd been given one of the finest private educations that a person can have, and with a very strong emphasis on American history and the culture of the early 20th century. I probably know more about the era than most college graduates. It was also heavy in languages, science and literature. And all of it has been augmented by Mother's psionic and magical teachings to impart knowledge whole cloth into my mind and sear it into my permanent memory. Most of all, there's been a heavy, and I mean heavy, emphasis on living on my own, and about 3 years ago I was told exactly why that was. And to be honest, I'm probably twice the Magecat my brother was when he was my age. I'm a lot more mature because I've been driven towards it. Dad jokes about trying to turn me into a young Doc Savage. After I gained enough control of my shifting abilities, my folks decided that sleepy little Walker County, Alabama, could probably not handle a second Magecat working his way through the local schools, especially with the intense extracurricular education I was getting. And so they packed me off to Sweden, where Mum took over as a chief archaeologist and anthropologist for the dig in Uppsala. I've been homeschooled ever since, and with my mum hiring tutors that make what the crown heads of Europe get look like rank amateurs. Not all of them were entirely human or mortal. Mum and Dad were under very explicit instructions from Ode's wife about the kinds of things I was to be taught. Now don't get me wrong, my whole life wasn't spent over books or in a dojo getting my ass kicked by Dad. I had more than enough socialization time with local kids of my age too. I would admit to that. Well, let's just say that compared to me, my brother might as well have been a monk with a vow of celibacy. And Sweden is just a little more open about these kind of things. I then took advantage of it. But, like I said, I knew this day was eventually going to come, and now it was here. I had gone to sleep in the year 2005 in my nice, comfortable bed in my parents' home in Uppsala. And I awoke in a room I didn't recognize with a tinny sound of Gershwin's Rhapsody in blue playing. I shook my head and looked over to see the very busty form of Brunhild, one of my Lady Valkyries and one of my occasional teachers. She was sitting comfortably in an overstuffed chair. Something about the air smelled wrong. Too much coal soot, and the smell of stale cigarettes, cheap liquor, sweat and sex were almost enough to make me gag. She smiled over at me and said, "It's about time you woke up. I was beginning to think you decided to sleep the day away." "Hild? What are you doing here?" I shook my head at the old teacher and added, "Where is here? Why does it stink so bad?" I'm glad you appreciate that, Win," she said primly, and then standing. "I've waited for well over 2 candle marks, but was told not to awaken you. Now get up, we've got things to discuss before I leave, and you begin what has been done." I shook my head and swung out of bed, and then realized I was nude. Blushing, I reached back and pulled a sheet around to cover myself. I was beginning to have a sinking feeling that today was the day I'd been dreading. Today was the day that my dad had come out of retirement and that I had to leave Earth. "Is it time?" She nodded and said, "At least your head isn't full of mush." And she stressed the word "your," and I knew that she was still smarting over the whole mess with Leaf. I wasn't going to play that game with her. "I'm just a little disorientated is all, Hild," I told her. "You still haven't answered my question." She nodded solemnly and said, "It's time. You may not return to your own Earth until after transhuman war is over. You will stay in this reality, this timeline, and carry out the mission Our Lady has given you." "What mission?" I asked her, confused. I knew I'd been educated for something, but it had never been quite clear. I looked around for my clothing but couldn't find anything. The only thing that seemed to have come with me was the small leather thong from which the tiny axe my grandfather had given me hung, and the gold hammer I wore around my neck. I held my wrist up and smiled at the sight of the axe, and with the use of a command word, it would grow to a usable size for me to take into battle. The hammer was a sign of my dedication to the gods of Asgard and Van Helm. She pointed over to a suitcase sitting next to a small round cherry tabletop upon which sat a white crocheted doily and a frosted glass hurricane lamp, complete with a rose etched into its surface. "Your clothes are over there, as well as some papers and some travelling money that you will need." I nodded and went over to the suitcase. It was an old-style, heavy leather contraption with buckles holding it shut. Realizing that I was going to look silly trying to cover myself and carry the suitcase at the same time, I simply let the sheet drop and hefted the thing onto the bed. I heard the distinct sound of metal springs under the mattress as it hit. I undid the buckles and flipped the cover back to see several pairs of slacks, all with cuffs, different shirts, a couple of jackets and more socks than I thought I'd ever use, and 6 bow ties. I looked up at her and asked, Where and when am I?" And she smiled and said, "Cumberland Notch, Maryland, about halfway between Boston and Washington, D.C. It's January 20th, 1928, as the humans measure time here. You are in what could be best described as a runner reality." I raised an eyebrow and said, "Please explain." "No, okay. Occasionally, events, powers, or sometimes just plain imaginative forces during an era can cause a smaller reality to branch off from one of the main limbs of Yggdrasil's canopy. And some of these realities will grow and form their own major series of historical events. And sometimes they are broken off or trimmed away or just simply die. Other times, and this is what is important about this reality, is that forces will bend it back until it is resorbed into a primary limb again, creating a loop in the limbs It's very rare, but it does happen. What happens when they merge back together? I asked. There are minor discrepancies in history and memory. Some events get written off as fairy tales or historical conundrums, even novels. This particular limb branched off about 100 years ago and has taken an unusual path. The point where it reattaches itself to your reality is right after a major event that will end the transhuman war. One of your kind will die in that event, and you will once again be allowed back into your own reality, she said with a frown. Who? I asked suddenly, worried about Dad and Trey. I cannot say, she replied, but what you do here will have echoes back in the primary reality from where you came. And there are forces beginning to move into this reality that you should be able to counter and maybe make a difference for yourself. How long before the transhuman war is over? I asked, wondering when I would get to see my family again. Longer for you than me, she told me as I pulled on a very old-style boxers and athletic shirt. Time moves differently here than in your reality, and different still in Alfheim. How differently? I asked, pulling on the khaki trousers. A little over 20 years will pass here for every one that passes in your own reality, she told me, and I felt my heart sink into my stomach. I put down the wool knit sweater and looked at her in shock. That means that it'll almost be a century before I get to see my family again. She smiled and said, Not quite, dear. One, you are not being abandoned here, shunted off because you are unwanted. You may still open the bridge to Alfheim, and so can they, but they are barred from here and you from your world. You may visit for the high holy days, and you may communicate with them through the high yard. You may even bring gifts to and fro, but when you return to your own reality, you will no longer be this man-child, but a fully grown and capable adult, if you survive. And trust me, your mother is far more upset about that than you are. I nodded, feeling a little more relief, and realized that the soft wool of the sweater I was holding was acting as the tactile ground for the culture shock I was already beginning to experience. And just holding on to it, feeling its texture as it played between my fingers, kept my mind from drifting down a long, black tunnel of despair. I got a hold of my feelings and forced myself to think about the job I had to do. I realized I didn't know what it was. What am I to do here? I asked. You are to establish yourself, you are to learn, and you are to fulfill Our Lady's commission to your kind. You are the only Magecat in this reality, but you are not the only unnatural, nor even only nocturnal. In a few years, there will be more, even stranger forces unleashed on this reality, and they are a threat to the inhabitants of this reality and can keep it from merging back into your own. It's your job to bring it back to the main limb, so to speak. You are Our Lady's feline factor here. Do what it is that Bryson Gaiman's owner had given you the gifts to do. Stand between humanity and those that would free and chain. I nodded, feeling both relieved and suddenly very, very frightened. I am back in time. I take it I should not try to interfere with the normal progression of history. She smiled at me and said, There are certain events that you cannot change. The economic disaster that will occur in little over a year, the attack on this nation 13 years from now, and those things you cannot change. However, that does not mean that you cannot profit from them to build your own power base here. And she stopped and looked at me. And that does not mean that you cannot use the gift that your lady has given you to compensate for the one your brother has and you do not. I guess the look of surprise showed on my face, and just as my brother had never told anyone of Freya's gift to him, and to this day, although I know that he has one, I still don't know what it is. I have never told anyone of the boon that Freya granted me, and she said it was something I would need for this mission, and it was she who told me about Trey's gift. Don't look surprised, Wyn. I have need to know, and so she told me. Nobody else knows, but be aware. Keep all that you are as a secret as possible. And part of the difficulties of this reality is that it does not deal well. It attempts to destroy those that step out of its cultural norms. In your reality, what you are is at least acknowledged. Here, you will be seen only as a monster to destroy, and there are those who will bring great power to bear unto you to see that done. You are a threat to the power that they wish to build. Looking down, I scanned the papers she had given me. A record of birth, a deed for a house and several plots of land, a bank book with a balance that would make me a wealthy man by this period's standards. All in my name. I realized I was going to need to convert it before October next year, or risk losing it when the banks went insolvent. And there was also a wallet with several $100s in it, and there were also a set of school records along with the name of the banker, and Mr. Babcock, who was in charge of my father's estate. She smiled at me and said, "This establishes you at a specific age. You'll need to be during several different crises. You will know what to do then. The money that's there is traveling money to get you home and for anything that I may have overlooked in setting up your identity here. We suggest that you put your gifts and your knowledge of what is to come to use so that you will be in a position to be able to do Our Lady's work without having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. There was a false bottom in the suitcase, and what you find in there, you cannot let anyone else in this reality see it." I nodded, thinking I understood what she wanted me to do. "Anything else?" I asked. "Just a few things. Do not forget what I said about not revealing who and what you are. The people of this reality do not deal well with those whom they perceive as outside the norm. Live as a thane, a freeman, but you do not have to shove it down people's throats. And for Freya's sake, have a little more self-control than your brother or Leaf. Don't let what's swinging between your legs do the thinking for what's sitting on your shoulders." I laughed. My brother had raised quite a stir over poor Rindvin, and there was still a bad blood between her, Leaf, and over Rindvari. I've had my share of sexual conquest, but I've also been very careful about it. I'll keep that in mind. "And you're probably not going to like this part," she said. "Yes?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I know how you feel about your hair, but you're going to stand out like an ox with the sheep. With it that length, you'll need a haircut." I nodded and frowned. She was right. I didn't like it. I had long hair ever since I could remember. Even Trey kept his long until he went into the Navy. But here in 1928, long hair was not acceptable for a 17-year-old boy. "I'll have it taken care of today," I told her. Why can't all of your kind be this easy to deal with?" she asked with a smile. Because all of my kind aren't as smart, strong, and good-looking as I am," I asked with a snarky smile. "You're one of Freya's, all right," she said with a smile. "One more question, though," I asked. "Yes?" "Why here? Why not wake me up in a house that's supposed to be mine?" "If you look at the address, you'll see that your house is in Colonial Bay, Virginia. You need to be seen traveling there to establish your identity," she said. "You have been living overseas with your family, who were recently killed in Austria in the unrest that's there. That will explain your knowledge of so many languages, and your education being what it is. I would suggest that you consider enrolling in a college as soon as you can. You will be well ahead of much of what is being taught on a bachelor's level here today. But some of it won't be that easy. There was a different focus for education during this time," she told me. I nodded. "I'll figure something. Is the reason I'm going to Virginia of any significance?" And she smiled and said, "That is where you will first have to deal with the forces I warned you about. You'll see." I smiled, knowing better to ask any further questions. "Tell my folks I'm okay," I told her. She stopped and smiled. "I'll do that. Now get dressed and be off with you. Your train for Washington leaves in 3 hours. You have time for a bath, some breakfast, and a haircut. and that shouldn't take too long, but then you've got to get a boat trip to Colonial Bay. It's just after sunrise here. I think it should be nearing dark by the time you make it home. Good luck, Win Greenbow." She then disappeared into the spray of the rainbow light. I thought about what she said at last. Northmen don't give away their luck casually. Her wishing me luck told me a number of things. One was that she wasn't quite so hard as she wanted everyone to think she is. The other was that I was going to need it. Hild had been right. It was nearly dark when I finally got the address on the deed. I was surprised to find a rather large Victorian domicile. I think Mum calls it the Queen Anne style. The only reason I remember that is she said she wanted to buy one that she likes that she saw in Seattle. The porch light was on, and so that meant that it actually had electricity, which was not exactly a given in 1928. It was a cold January dusk when I got out of the cab and paid the driver. I wrapped my heavy overcoat around me and grabbed my bag. My head felt a little on the light side, and I missed the warmth that my long copper hair had supplied me. There was a cold wind coming from the east, and I could smell and taste the salt in the air as I trundled up the steps carrying my suitcase. Evidently, it was near the new moon. I would have to check a calendar, and the tiger in me was very close to the surface. My senses were nearly supercharged. I smelled something else on the wind too, something that didn't quite smell right. It reminded me of the place where my dad took me, where Trey killed that giant on the night of the howls. And there was a taint to the air, a taint of blood. And more than just a touch of primal evil, it sent a cold shiver running down my spine. Something dead was moving around out there, and it was on the hunt. I quickly pulled the skeleton key out of my pocket and applied it to the large oaken door. And as I entered the house, I was surprised to find it warm. I could feel the heat coming from the furnace. I also detected the distinct odour of beef and potatoes coming from the back of the house. I put my suitcase down and followed the aroma, noting that the house was rather nicely furnished and even had what looked like a new electrical plugs in all of the walls. As I passed through the dining area and entered the kitchen, I could hear someone moving around. The scent of talc and gardenias told me that it was definitely a woman. "Hello?" I called out, not wanting to startle whomever it was. "In the kitchen," a woman's voice called back. I looked around the large area when I entered it, and there was a modern, for the period, stove. Evidently it used gas and an oversized refrigerator. A sink stood under the window on the other side, next to a door that evidently led out back. A somewhat plump woman wearing a pink dress and a frilly white apron was busy pulling a warm plate from the oven. She appeared to be at least middle-aged, but to be honest, I couldn't really say how old that was, as I knew life expectancies were completely different 80 years before I went to bed last night. "I'm sorry, I wasn't told that anyone else lived here," I said. And she chuckled and said in a thick Irish brogue, "Oh, I don't live here. I'm the housekeeper. Mr. Babcock hired to come in and take care of the place. He said to expect you this evening, and that you were coming, and on the train and all, so I thought you might like a bite to eat after. You're long travel." She wiped her hands on a towel and offered me her hand with a slight curtsy. "I'm Mrs. McCain. I live on the other side of town." And taking her hand and giving it a small shake, the way I was taught, I looked out at the deepening shadows as the night was stretching its long cloak over the small town like a dark blanket, and remembered the scent I'd caught coming up the door. "Thank you, Mrs. McCain. The thought is most appreciated. The trip was long, and the food at the stations wasn't what my mother would prefer that I eat," I told her, with a smile. "I'm Win Greenbow. Please tell me that there's at least an automobile here, so I can make sure you get home safely. It's getting cold and dark out, and the other side of town is a long way off for a lady to walk." She grinned at me and said, "Mr. Babcock said that you would be this way. If you don't mind, I'll use your phone. I can call my husband, and he'll pick me up. I just wanted to make sure you didn't get to your new home, and it'd be all cold and there'd be nothing here to eat. Except, what's in the refrigerator?" I laughed, thoroughly enjoying the sound of her lyrical accent as she played the English language like a flute. I've always enjoyed the Celtic dialects and found hers to be very charming. "Mr. Babcock said that you'd been all over the world and spoke a dozen languages." "Yes, ma'am. My parents thought that learning as many languages as possible might keep me out of mischief. Again, I appreciate everything you've done for me." "Well, the best way you can thank me is to sit down in that chair and eat up what I've cooked for you," she said, gesturing towards the table where she set the plate. "Yes, ma'am," I said with a smile and sat down. "And don't you worry about anything about the dishes. I'll get them when I come in tomorrow," she said as she took her apron off and hung it on the hook in the pantry. "I already turned the bed down in the north bedroom," I smiled and said, "Thank you." "You shouldn't have a problem with the furnace. It's new and there's a full tank of heating oil out back. You should be nice and cozy here tonight." She stopped and looked around and said, "I do hate to leave you here by yourself tonight. It's being your first night in town." I grinned at her and said, "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. McCain, but I'll be fine. I'm sort of used to being on my own now. Actually, I was missing my parents intensely, but I wasn't about to let her know about that." Well, this was going to take quite a bit of getting used to. I mean, I guess the idea of a 17-year-old being on his own for the most part was acceptable in 1928. Mrs. McCain didn't seem to think much about it. She gave me a sad look and I realized that she probably thought that my folks were dead. But that was something I was going to have to be careful with. I turned around and dug into my roast. I was quite good. The beef just fell apart at a touch of the fork, and the potatoes, carrots, and onions were all perfectly tender. And by the time I was finished, Mrs. McCain was putting on her coat. I got up and rinsed my dishes in the sink, and followed her outside to see her husband waiting in what looked like a Model T. I took a minute to introduce myself and make sure she got off safely. The whole time I was outside, I could smell something unpleasant on the air. Something was stalking through the town, looking for something. I could tell that much. I was on a quest to find something or someone. As the Model T disappeared down the road, I turned back towards the house. I had some exploring to do, and this would be the best time to take care of that. As I worked my way through the old house, from attic to cellar, I couldn't help but notice that it was supplied with all of the modern amenities available in what was sometimes known as the Model A era. The bathrooms, and there were two of them, a real luxury for this time, were all gleaming chrome and white porcelain. The furnace was a radiator-style hookup that used kerosene to heat the water. The electrical wiring was more akin to something from our own time than what was standard for the 20s and 30s, and that meant that it would hold up to the load of heavy appliances. Now I understood why my education was so heavy on early 20th century history and culture. Still, I had to be careful not to give away that I was an anachronism. I slowly came to realize that this house was expensive by Model A era standards. It wasn't luxurious like some millionaire homes, but it had the latest innovations available that were found in the most modern and new homes. I did notice that the furnace was more conservative than the Art Deco that was popular at the time, and for that I was grateful. I much prefer woods, natural textiles and fabrics to the hard gleaming steel and plastic that was becoming popular. It was also huge, much too large for a single young man of my age, or even for a young family. I wondered if its size was a reflection of what Hild knew that I was going to need, or if it was simply a statement by her about how she thinks the grandson of Jarl should live. Hild was very conscious of social class and status, and she may have been working from that angle. Still, there was something off about the place, and I just couldn't place my finger upon it. Finally, around midnight, I gave up and went to bed. It was going to take a while to get my bearings in this strange, new reality, and I needed a clear head for that. The calendar I saw on the desk in the study said it was Friday, and I was right about the moon. Well, that was good. Tomorrow, I would spend the day poking around the property and go into town to get the lay of the land. I wanted to see if I could find out whatever it was I'd smelled earlier on the wind. The next day, I got a major surprise. As I was coming down the stairs, there was a knock at the door. When I answered it, I found a tall, thin-balded man in his late middle ages standing at the door with his hat in his hand. He was dressed in a dark, conservative-cut business suit and was carrying a red leather valise. Even from 80 years out of time, he had a banker written all over him. He smiled at me and asked, "Master Greenbow?" he asked. I nodded and opened the door wider and said, "Yes." He smiled and offered me his hand. "I'm Boniface Babcock. I'm the manager of your trust." I smiled, wondering what was going on, but opened the door saying, "Please come in, Mr. Babcock. I'm sorry I can't offer you any coffee just yet, but I've only just arrived last night and have no idea what is stocked in the pantry." He looked somewhat surprised and said, "I suspect that you will have impeccable manners. Thank you, though. I'm here to discuss your portfolio with you." My portfolio? I wondered what this was all about. I smiled and said, "Why don't we go into the study then, so we can look over what you have to discuss?" He grinned and reached into his pocket and said, "You'll be wanting this then." He handed me an envelope with a key and a piece of paper in it. "Here's the combination to the safe and the key to the garage out back." I nodded and said, "You have to excuse me, Mr. Babcock, but I'm not very familiar with the house. Could you tell me where the safe is?" He smiled and said, "Can I see some identification first?" I nodded and said, "Yes, sir." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the papers that Hild had given me. He looked at the papers and said, "Of course, I'm sorry. You never can be too careful these days. It's in the study, built into the wall behind the desk. The previous owner of this house was rumoured to have shipping contacts, if you understand what I mean." I understood. In other words, he was a bootlegger and possibly a smuggler. I nodded and said, "I think I understand. As for the caution, it's quite all right." I appreciate it, even. Directing him into the study, I bade him to sit down in one of the blood-red leather wing-back chairs. I took the one opposite him with a table and a lamp between us. "I do have quite a few questions about my finances and this house, Mr. Babcock. I was planning on visiting you on Monday during regular banking hours." He smiled and said, "Under the circumstances, I thought it would be best if I came out to meet you this morning. I was the person responsible for hiring Mrs. McCain." "Thank you for that," I replied as I sat back into the chair. "Not at all." He set the valise down and took out a folder of papers. "Your parents, rest their souls, have left you in very good shape financially. You asked about the house. It's paid for. All the renovations they requested also have been paid for. Outside of a small credit account at the local grocer, butcher and petrol station, with a combined total of $22.60, you have no debt at all. You have an impressive array of very conservative stocks and a considerable holdings in gold, over 50,000 troy ounces at this time, which I suspect from the mines you own out west. There is an unusual set of instructions from your father about the disposition of a set of stocks that were set aside for speculation. I'm wondering if you wish to maintain those instructions." I looked at him again and wondered just who had set all this up. Were Mum and Dad aware of where I was going to be sent, so they made preparations for me? It made my situation hit me even harder. It was very easy to slip into the cover story that Hild had set up for me, to forget that they were still alive back in my own reality. I literally found my eyes misting for a moment. Mr. Babcock must have seen it because he reached out and handed me a handkerchief. I took it and wiped my eyes and said, "Please excuse me. Exactly what did my father want done with those stocks?" Now mind you, this only applies to the stocks in the speculative funds, not those in the general fund. But he's given me a specific date next year in which I am to sell them off and convert them to gold certificates, he said. "What date?" I asked with a sneaking suspicion that I already knew. "September 2nd, he said, looking confused. exactly one day before the peak market value, before it all started sliding downhill. Yep, somebody was already setting things up for me to be able to carry out my job. The Great Depression was coming, and I bet dollars to donuts that those were the stocks that were going to take a nosedive. And by getting out a day ahead of time, I would get quite a top value for them, but there would still be enough available in the banks to make the conversion to gold before the run hit at the end of the month. I nodded to him and said, I won't second guess my father. Leave them like they are. If he set that date, then let's play it out. I take it that the money involved there is not a significant part of my portfolio? It's a significant amount of money, but only a small fraction of the portfolio as a whole, he said. I nodded and thought for a moment, trying to recall everything Mum and Dad had drilled into me about the stock market and what was coming. Did my father leave any other instructions? Yes, he said. I'm not sure that you are going to like them, though. Please tell me, what are they? I asked, thinking that he might be surprised what I like and what I don't like. You are not to incur any debt towards this house, your automobile, nor any other holdings you might have. You are limited to $500 a month for expenses, and there is a very short list of major purchases for which you may be drawn on the account. Repairs to the home, school tuition, repairs to automobiles, and medical expenses, he said. He does indicate that you may need to spend whatever you take out of the mines in California and Nevada for anything you please. Until your 21st birthday on Halloween of 1931, you are limited to these restrictions. After that, the whole portfolio becomes yours. I smiled and said, my father always felt that person should be able to keep whatever he or she managed to gain for themselves. Thank you, Mr. Babcock. You mentioned an automobile. Is there one with the estate? Mr. Babcock nodded and smiled. Yes, a new LaSalle Phaeton is in the garage out back. The key to the garage is, like I said, in that envelope. The instructions for its purchase came just a month before your father died. He was planning on moving us back here so I could attend an American college, I told him. I looked around the room to see if I could find the safe. I let my eyes shift slightly to get a better detail and noticed a line in the wallpaper that was slightly off. I walked over and ran my finger along it and found that if I pushed against it, with a slight give, it clicked and swung out to reveal a floor-length door panel, and behind that was a large combination safe. Have you thought about college? He asked me. I'm not sure if I can be admitted just yet, Mr. Babcock. Although I've had a very good education in Europe, I don't know if I can get admitted to any college or university here. I took the paper out of the envelope and ran the combination. And when the huge door swung open, I saw a box with several papers, a couple of guns, one of which was a Thompson machine gun, and another stack of cash. I will look into what I can for you, he said. Perhaps with a few carefully worded letters to the Dean of Admission, I can get you admitted to Midvale over in Maple Grove. They're very good both liberal arts and polytechnical programs. Can you show me where you were schooled in Sweden? I nodded and handed him my papers. He looked at it and asked, Which one? I smiled, looked over and tapped the one that had the school's name on it. I don't speak German, he said, shaking his head. It's Swedish, I told him. It's related only slightly closer to German than English is. He smiled at me and asked, Exactly how many languages do you speak? Without looking back at him, I asked, Living, 17. Dead, 8. Hey, in my family, you learned as many languages as Mother threw at you. And since she was an alpha, and well over 1,000 years old, she knew a lot of languages. Of course, in those 17 languages was included 3 non-human languages, Alpha, Dwarfish, and Jotun. And I heard a low whistle from behind me. Oh, they really pile it onto you kids over there, don't they? I finished taking my quick inventory, noting the 2 large crates of ammunition in the corner, and then closed the door and pocketed the key. And turning back to him, I said, Yes, sir. The Swedes pride themselves on their education and their freedoms. I worked very hard for those grades, and I can guarantee you that they're very good. I managed to glance over them and found that they were good indeed. I also got the feeling that there was a copy of them at the school in Sweden where they were supposedly earned. I think we can work with this. You may have to sit some entrance exams, but I think that will be all, he said. I nodded and smiled, but before I could say anything, my stomach decided to make a rather loud noise. I blushed deeply and said, "Please, excuse me. I was just coming down for breakfast when you knocked." "Not at all, Win," he said. "I have a growing son your age myself. He's not quite as big as you are, but he's getting there, and he seems to be constantly eating." I laughed. I realized I was big for my age. Heck, both Trey and I always were, and so is Dad. Our particular strain of Magecat came from the heavy Nordic stock. Not even Mum's alpha blood did a whole lot to trim it down. At 17, I already stood over 6 feet tall and must over 220 pounds. And when Trey was in his mid-20s, he was 6'2" and weighed over 250, and all of it was solid muscle. And since I'm his clone, I expect to end up the same way. "I could see if we have any coffee in a cabinet," I suggested. "No, thank you. I need to be going anyway. I just wanted to meet you and let you know that the utilities and all are coming to my office, so you shouldn't have to worry about them," he said. "I'll also keep the accounts I mentioned at the grocer and such up to date. And Mrs. McCain will keep your pantry stocked for you and do some light cooking. But I suggest you learn how to cook for yourself." I smiled and said, "Already done. My mum always said that she didn't want me to get married to some little girl just because I got hungry. And she taught me how to cook, wash clothes, and take care of the house. Many in my family had a tradition of marrying late in life." "Not a bad tradition, if you ask me," Mr. Babcock said, rising and offering me his hand. I took it and smiled, and he said, "It gives you a chance to build up a little history and experience in the world before you tie yourself down. But these days, I'm not so sure. With women wanting a career and all, you may have to settle for a girlfriend for a while." I nodded and showed him the door. "Well, I think I can hold out. Right now, I've got to get settled in. If we can arrange it, get into college next term, and, like you said, make my mark on the world before settling down." "Good for you," he said as I opened the door. I looked out into the cold January morning. I could see a light layer of snow that had fallen overnight. His own Duesenberg was sitting in the driveway, and I noticed that a light scattering of snow was melting on the windscreen. Looking up at the sky, I said, "Have you heard the weather report?" He gave me a strange look and then said, "Do you actually trust those things? Half the time they're wrong." I smiled and said, "Not really, but it looks like more snow. I was just wondering if we were in for a winter blizzard." "I doubt it. We get some snow, but not a lot here," he said. I sniffed the air and realized he was right. It was cool, but nothing like what I was accustomed to in Uppsala. I figured that oddly enough, the main reason both areas were warmer than they should be was the same, the Gulf Stream. "I'll have to get used to telling the weather here," I said. He just chuckled and climbed into his Duesenberg and waved. "If you need anything, my number at home and at the bank is on the envelope." "Thank you," I said and headed towards the back of the house. The leather on the bottom of my shoes made a soft crunching sound in the gravel. I looked around and saw there was a very large backyard, complete with several outbuildings and a small pond. I pulled a key to the garage from my pocket and opened the doors. As the sunlight shone through the scattering of dust that cascaded down from the doors as they swung out, I saw a brand new 1927 LaSalle in a rich forest green and black. In my own time, it was considered a classic. Now, it was just a high middle-end car, and there were hundreds on the roads out there. I checked the gas and saw it was full. I nodded to myself as I headed back towards the kitchen, my stomach telling me to find something to eat quickly. By noon, most of the snow was melted off the road, and I was tooling around town in the old LaSalle. Actually, it was a new LaSalle, but to me, it was an old one. My dad had one just like it back in Sweden, something that he had lovingly restored, and he taught me to drive it at a fairly young age. Again, I started wondering exactly how much they knew about when and where I was going to be sent. And what really worried me about that thought, though, was the fact that he insisted I read all of those Lovecraft stories. And that was a thought that led to ideas I wasn't quite ready to contemplate. And there was a steady wind coming off of Chesapeake Bay, and I was glad for the aftermarket heater that had been installed in the car. I mainly wanted to see how the town was put together, to get a lay of the land, as it were. I had not forgotten that there was something evil stalking the area, and this was part of the reconnoitering the town to get ready to hunt it. Most of the business section of the town was about half a mile inland from the strip of tourist shops and such along the edge of the bay and beach, and there was a Woolworths, a Walgreens, and several mum-and-pop shops, and there were at least 2 gas stations, a Piggly Wiggly, a greengrocer, and a butcher shop along the main street, which ended at a large square with a Confederate memorial statue. On the other side of it was the town hall. At the north end of town was a deep water port for ships and pleasure craft heading up the Potomac, and a ferry that would take you across to the Maryland side of the bay. And to the west there were farms and lots of residential property. Further out, there was what was colloquially referred to as the other side of the tracks. Mainly small tenant farmers where the locals eked out a living scraping of what they could out of the marshy soil and toiling at whatever jobs they could find in town. My house sat on the south side of town on the edge of a little cove and with a large wooded area behind it. I stopped at a local diner, a little mum-and-pop's place called Irene's, and there were several Model Ts parked outside, and many of them in garish colours, and with weird slogans painted on them. One had painted on the cowling near the radiator, "Beware, Old Faithful, guaranteed to blow every 5 minutes." I got out of the car and entered the diner. I was immediately hit with the smells of soups, sandwiches and coffee, and I felt my stomach begin to tumble again. I also got the distinctive smell of raccoon. Looking around, I suddenly understood why. There was a table in the back where several people my age or a little older were sitting drinking sodas and talking, and 2 of the young men were in long raccoon fur coats. I shook my head, smiled and sat down at the counter. "What can I get you?" a tall middle-aged man asked. Looking over at the menu, leaning against the side of the counter, I quickly said, "A roast beef sandwich, clam chowder and coffee, please." He nodded and said about the order. I looked around and realized that most of the other customers were around the same age. One of the girls at the table looked over at me and smiled. I nodded back as the guy behind the counter set my coffee down. He leaned in close and said, "A piece of advice, kid. That bunch is a little on the wild side, if you know what I mean. You do well to finish your lunch and then move on out of town." I sipped my coffee, raised an eyebrow at the hint of chicory I tasted in it. "That's not exactly possible. I just moved into town," I told him. Well, you still do well to take my advice. Some people are best just left alone," he told me. I nodded to him and said, "I'm not looking for trouble. Just came in to get something to eat." He smiled and started back preparing the sandwich, saying, "That I can help you with. You say you just moved in? Where are you from?" I grinned and told him, "I was born in Alabama, but I lived in Europe for the last decade." "Ouch," he said. "You're over there during the big one?" I nodded and said, "I was living in Sweden. It was neutral, so the fight wasn't really close to us." "What were you doing over there?" he asked. "Going to school, mainly. My folks were scientists studying the Viking culture, and were involved in a dig in Uppsala," I told him. Of course, that wouldn't be for another 65 years, but at least the dig had already been started 2 years ago local time, so the claim would bear out most investigations. "On a level?" he asked, nodding his head as he put a huge pickle next to my sandwich and set it on the counter. "What brings you back here?" "My parents had arranged for us to move back here so I could go to college, but then they were killed on holiday during the Vienna riots last year," I told him. That whole place was a real beginning of Hitler's rise to power because it set off the Austrian Civil War. It was a good place to hide a fictional family. He gave me a sincere look as he dipped out the clam chowder. "I'm sorry to hear that. Putting the bowl on the table with a spoon, he asked, "So you got relatives here?" I shook my head and said, "No, just a house and a car. I got some distant cousins back in Alabama and a few even more distant relatives farther away. But this is where my folks had decided to move, so I thought I might as well come here and at least get the college degree they wanted me to get." I noticed that the noise at the table across the room had quietened down and some of the others seemed to be listening to us. I took a bite of the chowder and it was actually rather good. "This is good," I told him. He beamed me with a huge smile and said, "Best clam chowder this side of New England." I believe it, and told him digging in. I smelled him long before he reached the stool next to me. It was a mixture of sweat, hair oil, cigarettes, and oddly enough a hint of urine, female urine. I was definitely going to have to adjust to this era. And one of the guys from the table saddled up next to the stool next to mine and said, "Heard you tell Willie here, you're new in town." I nodded still, eating my sandwich. I waited until I was finished chewing and said, "That's right, just got in last night." He seemed to study me for a moment, measure me up and down. I smiled to myself and sat up in my stool, set my shoulders back and slid down. I towered over him and had a good 40 or more pounds of muscle on me than he had. I let out just a little bit of a tiger in my soul, smiled broadly and offered my hand. "I'm Win Grimbo." I watched as he shifted his weight back from me just slightly. His shoulders slumped for a second and then he took my hand and said, "George Tomlinson." I could see something flicker across his eye, a desire to assert a dominance. He started to grip my hand a little tighter, and I gave him a primal smile, and he suddenly got other ideas. "Hey," one of the girls came up to him and said, "If you're new in town, why don't you come up with us tonight? There's a little joint we know just down past Burnt Manor Cove. We're going to go cut a rug. You can meet some of the other people around here." George turned and gave the girl a quick and nasty look, but she ignored it. I simply shrugged and said, "Maybe another time. I have other plans for tonight. Maybe I can take a rain." I quickly caught myself from using an anachronistic colloquialism. If the invitation is still open, another time." I saw George's body language suddenly relax. He was off the hook. "Well, maybe next time," she stopped and said, "Where did you say you lived?" I grinned and said, "At Swan Point." "Hey, that's not far from where we're going," she said. "Maybe if you get back from whatever it is that you're doing early, you can come on down." I gave George a questioning look, something to make it clear that I wasn't going to step on his toes, and he seemed to look over at the rest of his group for some kind of confirmation. And finally, he said, "Yeah, come on down. There's the next road down from the one leading to Swan Point, the last house on the right." I grinned and said, "I may do that. It just depends on what time I'm finished." "The place is hidden on all sixes. I'm sure you can find a dame to get copacetic with." He grinned, seeming to warm to me a little more. He turned to the rest of the bunch and said, "Well, I'm going to scram for a little shut-eye. Guy's got to keep up his strength, if you know what I mean." It was at this point I noticed the sunken look in his eyes. He was running on pure willpower. This guy was what would be in my own time to be considered a hard partier. He looked over and nodded to everyone else and then left. As I turned towards the others to leave, I noticed the edge of a large bruise on his neck and wondered about it briefly. I'd read a lot about the petting parties some of the kids in these times went to, and wondered if it was just a hickey. Something told me it wasn't, though. I finished my lunch and paid the cook. By then it was nearly 3 o'clock, and the day was blustery and overcast. The sun would be setting soon, and so I decided to take a little ride out to the area George mentioned before things got too dark, and what I was beginning to worry was there started to move about. My problem was that I just didn't understand how nocturnals worked in this reality. At home, I was more than a match for any Neo or kin to vampire, and all but the most powerful damned. Whether one of us could take a Forsaken had yet to be seen, and so far we never had to come into conflict with them. I needed information. I had no idea of where to turn to get it. I got into the Lascelles and headed down towards home. Driving past the road that led to my house, I followed the bumpy gravel lane between the lengthening shadows of evergreens. I was reminded of a song I heard a long time ago. In the pines, where the sun never shines. For some reason, those lyrics sent a shiver down my spine. I found the lane George mentioned and pulled the car off to the side of the road. Getting out, I tossed my coat onto the seat and looked around. I listened for any sound other than travellers on the road and frowned when I heard nothing. There was only the sound of the cold January wind blowing through the trees. I let my body shift down into my house cat form and loped across the road to the copse of trees there. Immediately my hackles stirred and I could smell the stench of an open grave. Whatever walked these forests was no longer living, nor was it quite dead. I slowly made my way through the pine needles and blackberry bushes until I was looking into a large yard with a 2-story Victorian, not too unlike my own. There were several cars parked in front, and I could see no heat rising from their hoods, and so I knew they'd been there for quite a while. The shutters were all pulled, and a large German Shepherd-like dog was laying on the front porch, its eyes half closed. I slunk low and patiently stalked the edge of the high brown grass as I made my way around the yard, keeping a wary eye on the dog. As the wind shifted, I picked up the sounds of a shovel against the sandy earth and the heavy grunts of someone digging. By the time I worked my way through the marshy backside of the property that overlooked the point of the bay, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees to the west. I felt something powerful, something evil begin to awaken in the land. A mind cast itself out over the area. I suddenly forced myself to think about small birds and mice as I backed away from the property's edge. The mind had one thought: hunger. When I made it back to the car, the sun was already gone. I checked the Lascelles very carefully before I got in and started it up. I passed the road to my house and went back into town to the hardware store. I needed a few things. I hadn't had a chance to inventory the tools in the workshed at home, and I didn't want to take any chances. I picked up several tomato stakes and a good 2-pound sledge with a short handle. I of course had my axe, but the sledge would serve other purposes as well until I could talk to Gilfrey at the temple in my grandfather's steading. Of course, I still didn't know about the local undead. All of my preparations might be for nothing. Again, I checked the Lascelles over carefully before I got in and headed home with my purchases. I parked it and locked the garage door. I spent the next 4 hours making preparations. The hammer had to be blessed. I really didn't have the time nor all the preparations to do a proper blessing, and so I had to hope that the keeper of cats and Milgarth's water would grant the blessing anyway. Or if not, it was always my axe. Holy water was right out. I wouldn't be able to gather that until Ostara. It was nearly midnight by the time I was ready to head out. I decided against taking the Lascelles. I'd rather not be in a position where I could be identified with the car. I found an old Great War rucksack and stuffed all of the things I might need down it. And suddenly, I felt like that blonde girl on the television who with her Scooby Gang went around killing vampires and demons. At least I had the good sense not to fall in love with that one. I went upstairs and got a late shower. Hey, cut me some slack. I'm a cat, and we like to be clean. And besides, I got the feeling that it would be the best to at least to appear in style for the party. I was going to get an idea of what was going on. I picked a nice pinstripe suit and set of matching spats. I was really going to have to go clothes shopping on Monday, but for now, this would do. I decided to go for the young Leo DiCaprio look when I had my hair cut. That way I could avoid all of the oil that was popular during this time. I had no idea how that stuff would affect my fur when I shifted, and I didn't want to take a chance. I ran a comb through it and looked at myself in the mirror. The dark copper locks actually looked good this way. The slacks, however, had a huge amount of extra material in the legs, and I was reminded of what Trey used to tell me about why Navy still wore bell-bottoms all the way up until he was at the academy. They made great improvised life preservers. In case of these things, I could make an improvised life raft. Still, all in all, it didn't look too bad, and there was plenty of room to hide little trinkets if I wanted. I made a point to leave my ID at home and only took about $20 with me that I put into a money clip I found on the dresser. Hilde really did think of everything. I made a quick work of the 5-mile walk to the place, and when I want to, I can really move. I stopped and hid in the bushes to put my shoes back on before walking down the gravel drive. The house was all lit up and I could hear the long mournful wail of the blues playing in the background. I could smell the cigarette smoke from out here as I walked between a half a dozen or so cars, most of them old Model Ts. As I climbed the stairs, the German Shepherd rose and growled at me. I dropped my rucksack in the bushes and turned to let my eyes shift to the normal cat-like slits, something fairly easy for me to do during the new moon, and growled. "You're out of your league, boy," I whispered in German. "Sit," I commanded. He suddenly sat down but continued to follow me with his eyes. I knocked on the door, and when a big burly guy in a white suit came to it, I smiled and said, "George sent me." I could see his body was just barely above room temperature. He looked me up and down as if trying to see if I was a threat. He looked out the door at the dog, who had returned to lying down, and raised an eyebrow before indicating with his head that I should enter. "Come on in," he said. "Have a drink." I smiled and entered. The entire first floor had been converted into a dance area. I looked along the floor and saw areas where extra short boards had been added to cover where the walls once were. There was a low bar in the corner and another man with mixing drinks. In one corner I saw an elegant red-headed woman talking rather animatedly with George. I saw about half the group I'd met at the diner around the room, and some were dancing, others were sitting on low sofas, drinking, talking, and one or two were necking. "Win!" George said from across the room and waved me over. I worked my way around the couples dancing to where he was. As I approached, I paid close attention to the woman he was with. She was tall, very pretty, with peaches and cream skin and very blue eyes. "Hello, George," I said. "I just got finished, so I thought I'd come over." "Win, this is Lucy," he said, slurring his words. I could smell the cheap liquor on him. Looking over at his cup, I could see a dark amber liquid in it and assumed it was someone's poor attempt at whiskey. Nodding to the woman, I said, "I'm pleased to meet you. I'm Win Greenbow." She smiled back and replied in a very posh English accent that reminded me more of a upper middle class than an aristocratic, and said, "An unusual surname, Mr. Greenbow. I am Lucille West." She offered me her hand, and I shook it carefully. I felt something press against my mind. Now I was raised with a highly telepathic mother. Although I'm not a telepath myself, I have some formidable mind shields, and I can recognize when someone is trying to enter my mind or manipulate me. And when she said, "You will of course enjoy the party," I heard it echo in the halls of my brain like a command. "I'm sure I will," I told her, shunting the attempt of mesmerization over my shields. And it was originally Gronenberg, but it was changed when my grandfather moved to the US. "Oh, so you're Dutch?" she asked. "Both sides of my family are from Scandinavia," I told her. My father's side was from Norway, and my mother was from a very old Swedish family. I didn't tell her that there were legends that my great-grandfather had forged with the sword that the Lord gave as a bride price. And she smiled at me and said, "George here tells me you've recently returned from Europe. Austria, to be exact." She grinned and touched George's face, and I saw his eyes go blank. I heard the mental command, "You noticed nothing unusual." "Actually, he thought Vienna was in Italy," she said with a smile and took my arms in hers. "I've only recently arrived by ship from London myself, but it's been years since I've been to the continent. How are things over there?" I looked back at George, who seemed to be coming out of a fugue as he made his way over to the bar. I didn't let my eyes give any indication that I understood what just happened. I played the part of the innocent as I felt her cold hand against my forearm, just inches away from the axe I wore as a charm. Things are getting better for a while. but I think the recent unrest is going to cause more problems in the long run. I don't think the free world is quite finished with the Germany and Austria just yet." She stopped and looked me in the eye. I could feel her mind boring into mine. I called forth memories of films I'd seen of the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist Party. After a moment, she pulled away from me and shook her head. "You are quite an unusual young man, Mr. Greenbow. You have an unusual insight into European politics. I think I would like to speak to you at some length." "Perhaps tomorrow for a late lunch?" I suggested with a slight smile. She shook her head and said, "Perhaps later. I'm a night owl by nature. I tend not to rise until after sunset." Damn. It was too bad that Bela Lugosi's Dracula movie hadn't yet been released. This woman was a walking cliché. Nobody in my time would have missed that line, at least not in the US. Europe was still having issues with the geese placed on it by the Council of Whispers. I ran a hand through my hair to avoid giving away my smile and said, maybe another time then." "It is so refreshing to meet a young man with such manners and understanding of social graces, Mr. Greenbow," she said. "I must insist upon monopolizing your time some evening." "Maybe some quiet night in the future," I told her. "I live not far from here," and she smiled and I saw a slight gleam in her eye. "Yes, George mentioned that you and I are neighbours. Perhaps I can have you over for dinner one night." I smiled at the double entendre and said, "I think that will be an intriguing evening, Mrs. West." She gave me a strange look and I realised that on my first mission I'd already made a mistake. "It is Miss, is it not?" I asked, looking around as if for an angry husband. She seemed to relax and said, "Yes, it's Miss. I'm not married." "And can I get you a drink?" she asked. "Perhaps a cigarette?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." "Please don't tell me that you're one of those fundamentalist teetotalers," she said with a faint smile. I shook my head and said, "Although I don't smoke, I do occasionally take a nip or two." If she could play with double entendres, so could I. But this evening, I'm not thirsty. Before she could reply, there was suddenly a barking sound from the dog outside. "It's the Buttons!" someone yelled from the window. She turned to me and said, "Please, excuse me." "Everyone, please put your drinks in the refuse containers in the walls." She looked over at the barkeep and nodded. He turned and pressed something under the cabinets and I heard a grinding sound and watched as walls rose from the areas in the floor where the boards had been added. I smiled to myself as the bar itself disappeared behind a false wall. Lucy herself swept towards the door like a woman in charge that she was. I could feel her unleash her will onto the grounds around the house, and this place was about to become rather unpleasant. Outside I could hear the sounds of several men moving through the woods. I reached over and grabbed poor George by the arm and said, "Come on, the place is about to be raided." He was drunk enough, his mind had been manipulated enough that I was able to pretty much command him to do whatever I wanted. We slipped out the back door and along the wall. I could already see a mist rising from the ground. Evidently, that was what Lucy was doing when she released her will. In a little hidden alcove, I stood him against the wall and said, "Wait right here, and for God's sake, don't make a sound." He nodded, and I could see the worry start to show in his eyes. I slipped around the corner of the alcove and shifted down to my housecat form. There was so much ruckus and chaos going around me that nobody noticed tiger-striped Tabby running behind the bushes and grabbing a rucksack. When I got back to the alcove, George was standing very still as we saw policemen coming through the high weeds straight towards us. I looked over at him and said, "Don't say a word." I popped a claw and drew the runes I needed in the palm of my hand. I wasn't happy about doing it in the vicinity of so many vampires, but I really had no choice about it. I softly sang the runes and released my own will. And when a policeman's flashlight shone directly onto us, he saw nothing. I pulled George by the arm and said, "Unless you want to spend the night in the cooler, come with me." He nodded and we slipped across the back lawn. as we passed through an area near one of the sheds where I could see that something had been buried. I'd almost bet that whomever had been planted in that spot was going to sprout right back out in 2 or 3 days. And George kept waving at the policemen as we passed, astounded that they didn't seem to see us. And finally, I had to say in a harsh whisper, "Stop that. You're making it much harder." It didn't take us long to get deep into the woods and past the police cordon. I still wasn't going to take my chances. After about half a mile, I stopped and propped George against a tree and took off my shoes. He looked at me in astonishment and said, "What are you doing?" I stopped for a minute and looked at him. "Answer me one question first." "What?" "Has Lucy kissed you?" I asked. "What, are you jealous?" He belched at me. The smell of half-digested meat and alcohol turned my stomach. "Just answer the question, George," I demanded. He shook his head. "No, I was hoping to get in some necking tonight, but you showed up." I reached up and looked at his neck in the near darkness. I knew he couldn't see a thing, but I could see quite clearly. The bruise was still there. I reached up and pulled his collar aside and saw that it went all the way down his neck and onto his shoulder. And there were no puncture marks, though. "How did you get this bruise, George?" I asked. He pulled away suddenly and said angrily, "None of your beeswax." Again with the claw, the rune, the singing, I asked a second time, "George, how did you get that bruise?" I watched him struggle as the spell went off, and finally he looked at me and said, "Fine. Okay, have it your way. My old man drinks, and when he drinks he thinks I'm just another palooka in his way." He glared at me and said, "There, you satisfied?" I nodded and said, "I'm satisfied, George. I just had to make sure things aren't what they seem back there, and you were in a lot of danger." "Me? Danger?" he demanded. I nodded, keeping my will going. "Yes, you, danger. If your friends are lucky, the worst they'll go when they get in or out of this night is in the can." I looked back past him and still wasn't comfortable. We still had over 3 miles to cover, and I could tell something was watching us. Something with eyes that could see in the dark. I turned to George and said, "Look, fella, if we're going to get out of this with our skins, you're going to have to trust me. Can you see it all out here?" He shook his head and said, "It's pitch dark out here." I nodded and said, "I can see okay. I know the way to my house." For crying out loud, you can't see a thing either," he said. "Just trust me, George. I've gotten us this far, haven't I?" I counted. He stopped and seemed to think about that. I could see his booze-soaked mind trying to figure out how we'd missed out on being arrested. And finally, he nodded and held up his hand, 2 fingers down. "How many fingers am I holding up?" "3 in your right hand," I told him. I watched as he reached over and felt his hand and realized I was right. He looked astounded and then said, "Well then, lead on." We made it about another 1/4 of a mile before I realized we were being tracked, and it wasn't by anything living. Whatever it was fast, and its senses were preternatural. It could see as well as I could in the dark, and knowing that George couldn't see me, I let my body shift to its normal form. I needed my claws and fangs. Mostly, I needed my full array of senses as we made our way through the cold pine thicket. George wasn't a lot of help. I could move relatively silent, but he was crashing through stuff like a ball in a beehive. We got maybe another mile into the forest when I felt whatever was tracking us slip in front. I got a good whiff of it. It smelled of fresh earth and death, and it was getting ready to spring a trap. I didn't dare warn George. It would give away that I knew that it was there. I reached into my pack and pulled out the hammer. I said a silent prayer to the elderkin that the blessing had taken. And suddenly a man's form, big, black and shadow-like, rose up in front of us. He looked like a dock worker, but was covered in sandy dirt. His eyes were sunken and glowed an eerie red in the dark. I could see under his dark fingernails where he'd literally clawed himself out of the earth. His clothes were wet and clinging to his body, and he stank of death and decay. "I think Miss West wants to talk to you too," he said, garbling his words through fangs to which he was unaccustomed. Without thinking, I swung the hammer around between us and began whispering the words of the blessing again. I was surprised when a steady blue light began to glow from the center of the sledge. Like something from a bad 70s vampire movie, the man hissed and backed away from the hammer. Damn it, I wasn't wanting that dramatic of a show. Now I couldn't let him go back to Lucy. Now I had to destroy him because he could identify what I could do. "What the hell?" George asked, suddenly very frightened, and I could tell he was about to bolt. "Don't move. Don't do anything but stand there," I told him as I shifted the hammer to my left hand and held it out in front of me. The vampire was backing away, trying to shield his eyes. "What is that?" George asked. "A hammer, George. It's a holy item," I said. A hammer?" he asked. I shrugged and said, "I'm improvising, George." "You want me to hold it?" he asked. "I wouldn't do you any good, George. You don't believe." "Believe in what?" he asked. I reached up towards my wrist and pulled the axe charm from the thong and said, "Just stay with me, George. Tomorrow this will all seem like a bad dream." And then before either of us could react, I flipped the axe down and said, "Vaxa!" The charm suddenly grew in my hand and became a double-bladed war axe, 2 feet across and 1.5 feet high. "Eldre!" I said again as I rotated it in my hand and swung high. As the blade arced down towards the vampire's face, it burst into flames. He screamed once, the sound echoing out across the bay, as the blade sliced clean through his head and torso. I spun and swung a second time before his body began to fall, sweeping the 2 pieces of his head clean off his shoulders. As I came back around, I said, "Stodva Brenna, Girasma!" The fire went out, and the axe shrunk again in my hand, and I put it into my pocket as the light from the hammer began to fade. I looked down at the body and began to curse. This wasn't going to be easy. The vampire was too young. Evidently, he'd never fed. Or maybe things just didn't work the way they did back home. He wasn't dusting like good vampires do in the movies, not leaving a trace. George looked down on him and started to upchuck at the sight of the bloodless body. "You killed him," he said between bouts of spraying the local flora with contents of his stomach. "He was already dead, George," I told him calmly, my own voice sounding strangely detached. Shaking my head, I looked down at the body. I didn't have time to stop and dig a grave, and to be honest, I didn't want to take a chance on someone digging him up and putting him back together. I still didn't know how things like that worked in this reality. Finally, I settled on the only alternative I had. I sat George down on a log and started to work as he leaned against a nearby tree, occasionally throwing up until all he could do was dry heave. Hild said that my gift from Freya would come in handy, and it did. I couldn't use it to affect the vampire. His body was once living matter, and my power wouldn't work on it, but I could use it on the air around him. I folded the body up into as tight of a ball as I could, and I started transforming the air around him into stone. 1 pound at a time, I slowly built a boulder around his body. It took me around 10 minutes to get it to look like something other than a human-shaped rock, but I finally managed it. And when I was done, I could see where the drink had finally taken its toll on George, and he was passed out against the tree he'd been hugging while vomiting. In some ways this was better. I could carry him quicker than I could drag him while he was half drunk. I gathered up my rucksack and picked him up and threw him on my shoulder. The trip back was quiet, and I wondered what I was going to do with a drunk college kid when I got home. I got him into my house and put him into one of the guest rooms. I wondered what was going to become of the situation at Lucy's place. It looked like the police weren't going to be so easily fooled. The question was, how was she going to deal with it? I didn't think it was going to turn into a bloodbath. Lucy didn't strike me quite that stupid, and she could try to mesmerize them, but that was a lot of people to control at once. I sat and I waited, listening for the sound of a gun battle or something out of the south of me. And there was nothing. Tomorrow would bring a great many surprises. The Feline Factor. The Vampire's Daughter. Chapter 3. Let's get straight into that. I didn't sleep at all that night. I was too wound up and too nervous. I didn't think I'd done very well on my first outing. I realised I didn't yet have Trey's quick reactions, the experience to know what was the best thing to do. Maybe I was wrong when I said that I was a better Magecat than he was at this age. A year younger, and he had led JD's pack on the night of the Howls, and had fought for Forge. A year older, and he'd fought Krieger. And granted, he'd gotten his butt kicked, but he'd fought him and lived to tell the tale. Here I was, facing my first nocturnal, and as soon as the cops show up, I hightail it out of there. Damn it. I was trained for this stuff, and I still didn't have the sense of ease that Dad and Trey had when they did it. What was wrong with me? It was thoughts like these that haunted me all night as I listened for any sound of an intruder in the house. All I could hear was the steady sound of the grandfather clock in the living room, the occasional hammer on a pipe sound of the steam making its way through the radiators, and the steady backward and forward drone of George's snoring coming from upstairs. About an hour after sunup, I heard the sound of footsteps on the front porch, and then the scratch of a key in the lock. I threw my senses out and caught a whiff of Gardeniers. Mrs. McCain was at the door. She came in smiling and whistling something to herself. On looking up, she saw me standing in the door and said, "Oh, you're already up? And it's Sunday morning, no less." I smiled and said, "I tend to keep odd hours, Mrs. McCain. To be honest, I haven't yet been to my bed. I was up sort of thinking." She smiled at me kindly and asked, "Now, why would a boy like you be up all night worrying?" I laughed and said, "Not worrying, just thinking. I went out to a party, but to be honest, I didn't like most of the company. When a new acquaintance of mine got a little under the weather, I decided to bring him home. To make sure he didn't get into any trouble. It's rare a kind of man that looks after others, especially those he's just met," she said with that soft Irish brogue. "And even rarer kind of boy that knows when he's in a place he shouldn't be." And she put her hands on her hips and said, "You wouldn't happen to be about 5 miles down the road from here, would you?" I nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am. Like I said, I didn't care too much for the company, and so I came home." "And none too soon, I tell you then. My brother's son still hasn't showed up at home. There was a raid out there last night. The police took in a couple of kids for being out too late. Said they didn't find any liquor, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was out there. These bootlegger types are sneaky, you know," she said as she was headed down towards the kitchen. "Mrs. McCain, if you don't mind me asking, exactly what are you doing here this time of morning?" I asked her, following her. "Just wanted to make sure that you had a good breakfast this morning. Mass don't start till 10, so I thought I'd come over and whip up some eggs and sausage for you," she said. I grinned and said, "I appreciate it, but aren't Saturday and Sunday supposed to be your days off?" Following her into the kitchen, I leaned against the doorframe. She looked at the place and then turned to ask, "Did you eat out every meal yesterday?" I shook my head and said, "No, ma'am. I had breakfast and dinner here." She put her hands on her hips and looked around the kitchen. "Well, you sure could have fooled me. What did you eat?" I shrugged and said, "For breakfast I had steak and eggs and toast. For dinner I had salmon patties and some fresh greens and black-eyed peas. Why?" "Because I'm not used to boys that clean up after themselves," she said with a smile. "I'm doubly not used to boys that cook after themselves." And she gave me a wink, and her tone of voice suggested more than a little incredulity as she asked, "Salmon patties, black-eyed peas and fresh greens, huh?" She looked in the refrigerator and found a plate where I'd covered the leftovers with aluminum foil. She sniffed at them and then looked at me. "Not bad. I don't think that I would have put that much vinegar in my greens, but every person has their own tastes." And she stood and asked, "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" I smiled and said, My mother. She wanted to make sure that I didn't end up and marry the first girl that came along just because she could cook. Ah, a wise woman, that mother of yours, she said with a smile. Then clapping her hands, she asked, Well, what would you and your guest be wanting for breakfast? I grinned at her and said, Well, I was going to have eggs, pancakes and sausage. When he wakes up, I think he's going to be more interested in coffee and maybe oatmeal. That's not very hospitable of you. I smiled, realizing she didn't understand either how insulting that was to me nor why I was going to fix that. I simply said, if he wants steak and eggs, I'll fix them for him, but somehow I get the feeling he's not going to want them. Oh, and why is that? She asked. You already know what he likes? I shook my head and said, No, but I've been with enough of my friends in the morning when they wake with a mouthful of cotton and an empty stomach and a pounding head. The first smell of anything greasy sends them into dry heaves. The oatmeal was so that he could actually get something on his stomach that would stay. She gave me an appraising look and she took down a pan and set about fixing the breakfast I had suggested. Well now, maybe I misjudged you. Maybe you were thinking of your guest. She put some lard in a heavy frying pan and set it in the oven and turned it on. And then with sure motions of someone who'd carried out a task for years, she began to mix up some biscuit dough. Now tell me about the party last night. I shrugged and said, It wasn't much of anything really. Mainly a bunch of people smoking, dancing, drinking and listening to music. Not really the kind of thing that I like. I never heard a kid your age who didn't smoke, drink and listen to music, especially a boy. She gave me an inquiring look. You aiming for a priesthood, are you? I shook my head and said, Not at all. I don't smoke because I don't like the smell of it on me or anyone else. I won't even go out with someone who smokes. It just ruins my clothes that I spend too much money on for. And I end up smelling nasty. As for music, I like jazz, okay? It's not my first choice of music, but it'll do until what I like comes along. What about drinking, Pat? I know it's illegal and all, but the prohibition, which hasn't done a bit of good in stopping people from drinking. I take it every now and then, but I don't drink somebody else's booze unless I know the person who made it or it comes from a reputable source. I can't say either one about what was being served last night, and so I didn't drink it, I told her. So there was drink there last night? She asked. I smiled and said, From what I could tell, yes ma'am, I told her. I could hear George was beginning to move upstairs. It didn't take long for him to find the bathroom and then come wandering downstairs. Not that I would tell anyone else that, I told her. But at the same time, I don't hide what I do. But unless someone is going to get hurt, I keep what I know to myself. She nodded at me as we heard George's footsteps on the stairs. Ah, sounds like your guest is awake. I smiled and went over and set up the coffee pot. It was one of those old-style setups where you had to put the grounds in the holder, then put water in it and set it on the stove. She looked at me strangely when I started scooping the coffee in. I grinned and said, My father was an old Navy man, and coffee was meant to be strong in our home. And she nodded and said, There's strong coffee, and then there's living coffee. And that stuff you're brewing looks like it could wake the dead. Before I could reply, I heard George's voice from the door. Aunt Martha, what are you doing here? She looked up at George and said, George, I could ask you the same thing, boy. Your father is worried sick about you when you didn't come home last night. Ah, applesauce, he said, looking over at me, and he asked, Can I use your phone? I nodded and said, It's in the study. I put the pot down on the stove and said, I'll show you. Once I got him out of the kitchen, I asked, Are your aunts likely to rat on you about the drink to your dad? He shook his head as we stepped into the office and said, No, she's more likely to twist my arm about mass though. Okay, I nodded and said, Tell your dad I'll bring her home right after breakfast. You can tell him you spent the night here last night and you showed me around the town. I turned to leave and he asked, When? I stopped and looked at him, answering, Yeah. Did what happened last night happen? He asked. And I thought, gods, if only I had to explain what that meant the last time someone asked me that. What do you think happened? I asked warily. The party, the raid, the guy with the fangs and bad breath, the hammer and the axe, he said. Yeah, that happened, George, and I want to talk to you about it before I take you home, I told him.
You really killed that guy?
He asked. I listened carefully to make sure I could still hear Mrs. McCain in the kitchen. The soft strains of her humming and the sounds of bread dough slapping on the marble slab were clear to my enhanced hearing. I turned back to George and said, He was already dead, George. He was a vampire, and he was about to make us his first meal. George nodded and said, Okay, we need to talk. Let me call my old man and then we can eat. Why didn't you tell me that my aunt was your housekeeper? I smiled and said, Why didn't you to me that my housekeeper was your aunt?
I didn't know,
he answered. Neither did I replied.
You rich?
He asked. I'm well off. I plan to be loaded by the time I'm 21, I told him. If my plans went through next year, then I definitely would be.
Well, I'm glad to hear it,
he said. Turns out that my guess about George's desire for bland food was wrong. He was more than ready to chow down on some of his aunt's home-cooked breakfast, as she made it clear that she put in a good word for him with his dad, as long as he promised to make it to evening mass tonight. He agreed in a heartbeat. As we ate breakfast, I told Mrs. McCain that I would take care of the dishes and make sure that George got home. She reluctantly agreed. As she headed out of the kitchen, she told George, You listen to this one. He's got a good head on his shoulders. After we heard the front door close, George looked over at me and said, Well, that's got to be worth a bit of leash off the old man. If Aunt Martha tells him about me staying here last night and she thinks you're a swell fella, then I should get off with just a scolding. George, I'm worried about you, I told him.
Well, because of last night?
He asked. I nodded and told him. Because I think that since we slipped away, she may come looking for us, or send someone after us. If she's got half the brains I think she does, then we're loose ends that could be used to tie her up.
What can you tell me about vampires? He asked.
I mean, I vaguely remember reading a part of a story about them. I've heard a few tales, but they're in Europe and this is America. That's the kind of thing that our forefathers kind of wanted to get away from. I shook my head and said, I really don't know. There is so much information on them that's contradictory. Some of it's pure fantasy. Some of it is lost in literary license. I wasn't about to try and explain that I was from an alternate reality where there were 4 different kinds of vampires, all with different powers and power levels.
You're complaining about too much information and I don't have enough.
He laughed over his coffee.
What can you tell me, for sure?
I sighed and said, They are neither living nor are they dead. They're undead, and they are a walking corpse sustained by the blood of the living that they drink. And those who are bitten and die become vampires. Some legends say that they have a limited form of shapeshifting, where they can take the form of a bat or a wolf. And they're supernaturally strong. The saying is the strength of 20 men. I can tell you for certain that Lucy can dominate someone's mind, make them see or not see, hear or not hear, anything that she wants, or even do things against their will.
How do you know that?
He asked, tearing into his eggs. He was showing no signs of a hangover that I'd expected him to have this morning. Because I watched her do it to you, and I felt her try to do it to me, I told him. He stopped and looked at me, his fork hanging motionless in front of him.
How come you're immune?
I considered his question. Just how much could I tell him? I wasn't sure. I kept remembering Hild's admonition against letting others know what I am. I was finally going to have to walk the same path that Trey did when he was in high school. I was going to have to keep what I am a secret. I shrugged and said, I really wasn't. I guess I sort of suspected something, so I was careful not to look into her eyes.
How did you avoid that? He asked.
I smiled and said, Don't tell me you didn't notice that dress she was wearing last night. It was cut all the way down to her belly button. There were more interesting things to look at than her eyes. It was an outright lie, but if it kept my secret, let him think that I am a boorish horn dog. He grinned and said,
You got a point there.
And then, as if realizing something, he put his fork down and said,
Oh no, I'm such an idiot.
What? I asked him.
You must be right about This making people believe what she wants. Oh man, I really messed up, he said suddenly, seeming to remember something unpleasant. Listen, can I use your phone again? I smiled and looked over at the clock. It's almost church time, but do you think it can wait? Oh, applesauce, he said again. Yeah, I guess I'll have to. He sat back down and asked, what do you know about dames? I laughed and shook my head and told him, I may be smart, but I'm not a god. Women are a subject that will forever confuse men. And then I shrugged and asked, what do you mean? I'm going out with one, that kind of thing, he said. I screwed up. Me and my Sheba had a fight about that party last night. She didn't want to go and didn't want me to go. Did you lie to me last night? I asked, knowing full well that he hadn't. What do you mean? He asked, suddenly defensive. I asked you if Lucy had kissed you. You told me no, I said. He shook his head. No, she didn't kiss me. I smiled and then asked, tell her the truth. You went there, realized she was right, and then left with me. And we were here all night talking about her. I'll back you up on that. It's been my experience that girls like it when you're willing to be wrong, occasionally. And that is girls back in the 21st century. There will be some grovelling involved. There's always grovelling with a girl when they know they're right. Always? He asked with a wink. Just how much experience with this kind of thing do you have? Is it true what they say about European women? I smiled and sipped my coffee. To put it the way Dad would say, I've dipped my wick more than a time or two. On a level? He asked. How many? How many times or how many partners? I asked. Both, he asked as if he wouldn't believe me. I can't give you an exact number. A dozen or so, I guess. He sat down and whistled. A dozen? What did you do? Go through a whole grade level in school? I just smiled and said, something like that. Things are different in Europe than over here. The Swedes have a particular reputation in my own era, and they lived up to it. I wasn't sure about here, but I figured that we would be able to check up on it. I shook my head and then added, but those were just somebody to play with. They weren't relationships. We both knew that it was just about the sex. How did you keep from knocking them up? He asked. I sighed and said, there are ways. You just have to be willing to use them. And then I smiled and added, but of course, they're the kinds of things that good Catholic boys who go to Mass for their aunts don't do. And I gave him a big smile. So's messing around, he told me. I figure I might as well be hanged for a sheep as hanged for a lamb. As we finished out our breakfast, I told him what I suspected was the truth about the vampires here. I also decided that I really needed to find out more about the raid Mrs. McCain was telling us about. Look, how many of your friends were at that party last night? I asked. And he thought for a moment and said, 3 or 4, maybe. Not a lot. Or there was Robbie and Joe and Helen. She's the girl you were talking to last night. The others, they didn't show. After church, could you try and call them and find out what happened last night? I asked. Well, if what my old man says is true, then they won't be talking to anybody for a while. They got pinched and their folks had to pick them up at the station. Most of them are in big trouble with their folks. Seems like the biggest trouble I'll be in with Pops is that I didn't call. He did say that he was going to check my story out with Aunt Martha, though. I nodded and said, still, I need to find something out. I think I'll do some snooping around today. Good luck with that, he said. Nothing will be open except a few restaurants, 1 or 2 service stations, and the ice cream parlor. It's Sunday. I nodded. I'd forgotten about that. I remember Trey complaining about the way Oakman and Jasper locked up tight as a board on Sundays and Wednesday afternoons when he was a kid, and that was in the 60s and 70s. I was stuck. I could go check out her place in the daylight, or I could go and see what kind of gossip I could pick up at the locals. I figured she'd be laying low for a few days, and her place would be more secure than Fort Knox. It wasn't likely this little kitten could get in. Who's likely to be at the ice cream parlor today? I asked, remembering something I'd seen on the Food Network about the origins of the ice cream sundae. His eyes suddenly lit up and he said, Hey, just about everyone who's not in trouble should be there after church. It's the only place on Sunday where all the good Catholics and Protestants can all go together."
I nodded and smiled. "What time?" I asked.
"Usually around 2:30 or 3, after lunch," he said.
I grinned. "Then how about I take you home, and you can deal with your father? Then you can meet me there, and we can talk about some of your friends, about what they know about what happened out at Lucy's last night. And then you can go home and get ready for the evening mass."
"Hey, you don't expect me to follow through with that, do you?" he asked.
I gave him a long look. "Yes, I do. If I were going to be dealing with vampires, I need you very concerned about the state of your soul. Besides, a promise is a promise, and a deal is a deal. Your aunt has agreed to help us in return for this small favor. If there's one thing in the world that is important, it's keeping your word."
"You are a queer bird, you know that, Win?" he said.
"You have no idea, George. You have no idea," I told him.
"Well, I got an idea. Why don't you come to Mass with me?" he said.
I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, not my religion."
"Ah, Protestant, huh?" he said.
I said nothing, let him believe what he wanted. I didn't think it was a good idea to tell him that I'm not a Christian at all. Like Hill said, I don't have to go and hit people in the head with it. I did manage to get him dropped off at home, and I figured it was best that I didn't go in. He had to deal with this as best he could. I went back home and grabbed about a 2-hour nap, then a quick hot shower. Actually, I can go several days without sleep, but I prefer not to do it when I don't have to, and I was afraid I was going to need to soon. Chapter 4. Let's get straight into that. I made it to the little ice cream shop beside the Woolworths just after 2 and found a seat towards the back. I grabbed a paper and read the story about the raid on the front page of the Sunday edition while sipping my coffee. I have to admit that the soda jerk gave me a bit of a strange look when I ordered coffee. But hey, it was in the 20s outside, and I don't mean centigrade. The coffee was warm and strong. And the paper said that there was a raid on a house suspected of being a speakeasy, but nothing about a few errant young adults that were found. I guess the term teenager hadn't caught on yet. And they were returned to their parents and the home was searched, but no illegal alcohol was found. The owner was cited for disturbing the peace, and the police left. It sounded like the use of her hidden walls and her mental manipulations had paid off. However, I doubted that she would be likely to get caught a second time. I bet she would be changing her tactics soon. The trick was to find out what she was up to. The idea of dominating and controlling a town this close to a major metropolitan area like DC was ludicrous. It offered too much of a chance of discovery, and she had to be after something else. I was deep in thought when I realized that it was George coming through the door, and there were 5 others with him. I looked up and smiled as they all stopped by the counter and ordered ice cream sodas. I shook my head and asked for a refill on my coffee and ordered a piece of pie as I snagged a larger table in the corner for George and his gang. In a few minutes everyone was settling in. George smiled and said, "I'm in the clear, and Martha put in a good word for me, and Pass was just happy I wasn't there when the raid happened." I smiled and looked at the gathering of teenagers that were sitting at the table with us. They all looked to be about my age, but I wasn't really sure. Again, there were major differences in adolescent development between the 1920s and the first decade of the 21st century. George smiled and said, "This is Betty Gardner, the girl I was telling you about." I stood and shook hands with a tall, buxom girl with brown hair cut in a short bob. She was rather attractive, and what I found to be the most striking was that she wasn't trying to hide her bosom like so many girls I'd seen on the street were. She had something up top and wasn't trying to make it look like a 13-year-old boy. I could see why George was attracted to her. And when she finished filling out, she was going to have a very classical figure. "I'm glad to finally meet you, Betty," I said, standing and shaking her hand. "George has a lot of nice things to say about you. I'm Win Greenbow. I just moved to town." She smiled and turned a quick look at George, and I realized that I'd managed to score a few points for my new friend. "I'm glad to meet you too. George told me what you did last night." I looked over at George and he quickly said, About talking me out of going to that party." I nodded, and then he introduced a tall, thin young man with brown hair, blue eyes, and the beginnings of a very aquiline nose. This is John Lee. We call him Long John. He's a Midvale, on a basketball scholarship. Nice to meet you, John, I said, shaking his hand. He had a firm but not overpowering grip. I could also see that he seemed to be sizing me up for something. The pleasure's all mine. George tells me that you bought the old Mason place out on Swan Point. That's right, I said. Rumour has it that the place was owned by a smuggler, that there are secret passages under leading to the bay, he said. I shrugged and replied, I haven't had much of a chance to explore, but I'll be sure to look close in the root cellar. This is Jimmy Babcock, George said, pointing to a rather handsome young man, dressed very fashionably. He had slicked back black hair, blue eyes, and like I said, very handsome features. He also looked just a little bit sad. I offered my hand and he looked at it for a moment like he was unsure of what to do with it. Finally, he shook it with an almost apathetic air. I'm glad to meet you, Jimmy. Are you in any relation to Boniface Babcock, the banker? I asked. He nodded and said, My dad. I nodded, not quite sure how to take this guy. I didn't think he was being rude, as much as he just seemed not interested in what was going on around him. That could be a fatal mistake dealing with Lucy. I grunted and turned back to George. George pointed out a rather attractive guy with a hair the same coppery sheen as mine, and laughing green eyes. He was on the small side, about 5'6", I guess, and had a wiry build. I noticed several scratches and bruises on his knuckles, and I wondered if it was from fighting or from being a shade tree mechanic. This is Eddie Grant, the other half of our war between the states, George said with a smile and then indicated both he and John. And then I got it, Lee and Grant. Eddie smiled at me and offered his hand enthusiastically. George is always going on about that. Thing is, John really is a descendant of the late general, but I'm just a regular old Grant from here in Virginia. I smiled and said, It's nice to meet you too, Eddie. Is that your LaSalle outside? He asked. I nodded and he added, Nice car. How's it run? I smiled and said, So far, so good. Finally, George pointed to the girl with a severely cut short white blonde bob that looked more like it had belonged to a boy than a girl. She was trying and not doing a very good job of hiding a curvy figure in a pair of slacks and a white shirt. And she was very pretty, but she seemed to not care about that. When I could see an intelligence behind her baby blues that was taking in everything around her. This is Dot Tynesdale. She's just one of the guys. I gave George a look like he had to be kidding. This girl was not just one of the guys, and if these dunces were blind to it, then they needed their collective butts kicked. I nodded to her and shook her hand, noticing that it wasn't the dainty handshake I'd gotten from Betty, but was a firm handshake like a man's, and she looked me dead in the eyes. It's nice to meet you, Win, she said. Trust me, the pleasure's all mine, I told her. Then indicating the chairs, I said, Please, sit down. We all returned to our seats, and I sipped from the coffee. And with a look of concern, Betty said, George tells us that you were asking questions about Lucy West. Her voice dripped ice at the mention of the woman. This was a girl who knew her territory was being threatened and didn't like it one bit. I shrugged and looked to George, and he shrugged and said, I just told him that you met her last night and you didn't trust her. It was a neutral enough comment. I'm wondering, though, why should we trust you? Jimmy said with an almost bored tone. You've lived here for even shorter time than she. Evidently she at least puts on a good party. I nodded and told him, You're right. You shouldn't trust me. I watched for what I'd just said to sink in. You shouldn't trust anybody, really, except for people you know. I'm not asking you to trust me, just to tell me what you know about her. Why should we? Long John said. Like Jimmy said, we don't know you either. I gave him a smirk and said, Because I'm asking. I'm not trying to trick you out of anything. I'm just simply asking. It would probably be better if you didn't tell me. You might not like what kind of things you're likely to find out about if you do. I turned to George, hoping that he would be as smart as I, and thought he was. Right, George? I watched their minds work as they considered my answer, and finally Eddie spoke up and asked, What? You think we can't handle it? I didn't let my smile show on my face. No,
I think some people are usually happier when they don't know everything that's going on. I put my coffee down and stood up. I used a technique my mum used to use on me. I looked down at Betty and said, "George's really one of the good guys, you know? If you want to keep him, stay away from Lucy West. I've got some things I need to do. If you think of anything I might want to or need to know, tell him. He'll give you my phone number." As I walked out, and I dropped a quarter on the table as a tip and left. I knew if I tried to push them, then that would create too much resistance. In some ways, these guys weren't quite as mature as 18 and 19-year-olds back home. But they still had that rebellious streak in them that we all do. As I pulled away from the ice cream parlour, I saw Eddie standing at the window, watching me pull away. That was at least one. I went home, and there wasn't much I could do really now. George was right, the town was locked up tighter than a drum. I spent the rest of the day exploring the property. And there was actually a large chunk of it, turns out over 200 acres. And there were several outbuildings, in one of which I found a working smithy, something I thought I might actually be able to use. I also did a closer inspection of the basement after Long John's comment. Even with my enhanced senses, I almost missed it. A slightly off-kilter foot on a rack of shelves on the southeast wall was the only thing that gave it away. I tapped it with my foot and heard a click, and then the whole wall swung outwards. Looking inward, I found a large room with another set of shelves like this one on the opposite wall, and that was set in slightly ajar. Studying it, I realised that as I swung it close to a knot in the pine panelling next to it, it sort of bulged out. I smiled and looked around. It was a very large room and well furnished, complete with several sturdy tables, workbenches and chairs. And best of all, it was wired for electricity, heavy-duty electricity. In one corner was an old-style wireless set for transmitting as well as receiving. I could see a wire leading from the antennae leads to a small hole in the wall. I assumed that there was an antenna hidden in the trees somewhere down near the coast. And this sort of confirmed the idea that the previous owner was a smuggler. And by the time I came out and back upstairs, it was well after dark. I briefly considered heading out towards Lucy's place, but decided that she and hers were probably laying low on the day after the raid on their place. Instead, I turned in early and got a good night's sleep. The next morning, I had plans to put my alpha shape-shifting powers to good use. I think it was time that the local shipping houses got inspected for possible bootleg contraband and all. Nobody can ever say that I don't have a sense of humour. Let's just say that a particular movie star famous for this portrayal of a 1960s spy, and eventually an Irish cop opposite Kevin Costner, spent the day inspecting the books as part of the Bureau of Prohibition. It was amazing what I found. 36 boxes of gardening loam shipped in from England by one Lucille West. That at least told me that she needed her native soil to sleep in. And from there, I went on to check with several overland shipping companies. It would seem that Lucy was smarter than an average vampire. I was able to find out that she'd shipped out 30 boxes to different cities all over the eastern half of the United States. The best part was that when she went looking for the inspector who'd been following up on her, he wouldn't even be born for another 2 years, and then it would be in Scotland. By about 2, I'd already picked up a trail, and not my usual kind. I noticed them at several stops I'd made along the way. I was finished with my inquiries, and I was headed out of town when I noticed the old stewed baker following me. Okay, I didn't realise it was a stud baker until it was close enough for me to read the name on the little round hood ornament, and by that time they were way too close. Suddenly, the black sedan whipped alongside the Model A I'd rented and swerved towards me. I braked and pulled over into the grass shoulder and watched as they suddenly slowed in front of me. I quickly looked around to make sure that nobody was nearby, and seeing that the coast was, as they say, genuinely clear, I killed the engine and I got out. Suddenly, 5 men poured from the Studebaker and came rushing back towards me, and there was no question as to their intent. I was still wearing our future fictional spy's most famous form, and so I wasn't worried about being identified. I knew this was going to be a fight, and so I stepped back into the semi-defensive position. The first guy charged me like a linebacker, and as he ducked his head and spread his arms wide, I kicked him once hard in the groin and watched his eyes suddenly focus on the end of his nose. As he folded over, I punched him in the side of the jaw. I felt the bone shatter under the force of the blow, and he went down like a load of bricks. The other four slowed only for a moment before spreading out wide around me. I looked around and watched their body language to see who was giving the orders. One of the bigger guys, from the size of him and the muscles he was displaying. I'd have said he was a teamster or a longshoreman and seemed to be in charge. He was also holding back from the rest of the group. I heard and felt the two charge me from each side more than I saw them. I jumped straight up and kicked out in opposite directions. The one on my right I caught squarely in the shoulder and felt the bone break under the transhuman strength. As for the one on my left, my foot smashed into his chin and compressed his jaw backwards, lifting the base of his skull and sent him into sleepy time. It was a fairly simple technique, but could only be highly effective when used right. I didn't want to kill anybody. I wanted them to report back to whoever sent them, and that would take the attention off of what I was going to be doing later. The ones whose shoulder I hit barreled past into the path of the guy coming at me from behind. Landing, I grabbed both of them by the head and smashed their skulls together. Not hard enough to kill them, but definitely hard enough to render them unconscious. When I looked up, our ringleader was reaching into his jacket. I wasn't quite ready to let anyone know that I was bulletproof, at least a small arms fire, and so I leapt. I hit him hard with a right cross that I'm sure shattered his jaw. As he crumpled, I reached in and pulled out the old Navy Colt from his jacket. Nice firearm, lots of knockdown power, and fairly accurate even when it was a pain in the butt to load. I bent the barrel over and hurled it deep into the woods. Working quickly, I gathered up all the men and put them back to back in their stud baker, and then with a grin, I reached in and ripped the steering wheel off of its column and laid it in the driver's lap. As I pulled back off the side of the road, I checked my wristwatch. That took less than 5 minutes. I realized just how lucky I was when I turned a curve to find another car coming my way. If I'd taken much longer, I might have had some explaining to do. And dropping off the car at the rental place and finding some place to change took longer than I thought. By the time I was back in my normal form and recovered my LaSalle, it was getting late. And there was an old bookstore I'd seen coming into DC that I wanted to visit before I headed back to the Colonial Bay. It was a little hole-in-the-wall type place over on F Street, just around the corner from the Ford's Theatre. As I entered the old place, I couldn't help but feel the tingle of magic around the building. I let my eyes slip into my other sight, and I could see 2 or 3 lines of eldritch forces snake around the rooms as wards and charms. Each of them led back to the oldest gentleman sitting behind the counter, reading what looked like the latest issue of Weird Tales. He was a massive and muscled man, not what you would expect in a bibliophile, and with a heavy blonde moustache and bulbous nose that showed the spidery traces of blood vessels along its base. He had a clear brown eyes and a thick mop of straw-coloured hair that seemed to refuse to submit itself to the will of a comb or brush. His suit was of brown tweed and gave the impression of someone who took meticulous care of it. His hands were massive, and I noticed calluses on them, like someone who was not accustomed to hard work. I cast my eyes about the room. There was some kind of ward obscuring most of the books, but I was able to see through them. This was the kind of place that my sister-in-law would love to find. A bookshop full of actual magical tomes. I walked up to the old man and said quietly, "Excuse me." He looked up from his magazine, as if he was just noticing that he had a customer for the first time. A slightly panicked look came across his face as he looked around the room as if to see why he hadn't been warned, and why the wards hadn't gone off. And then his eyes came back to rest on me, and the most astonished visage came across his face, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He finally found his voice, and it was deep and melodious, like a large bell when struck. "Can I help you?" The accent was upper-class New England, and there was an underlying hint of worry and maybe fear to it. "Yes," I said carefully. "I was wondering if you had any books on dealing with the undead." Again, the startled look came across his face. "I beg your pardon," he said carefully, almost giving me the impression that he had been offended. "The undead, Nosferatu, Lamia, vampire?" I asked again. "Now what would an impressive young man like yourself want with such a tome?"
he asked, getting off his chair and coming around the counter. He navigated his bulk through a passageway rather easily as he seemed to size me up and down. I raised my eyebrow and looked around the room, and finally I said, "I'm a student of such matters. It's something of a vocation. You could say a calling." "A rather unusual calling in this day and age," he said as he slided down one of the wide aisles of books, and finally he reached up and pulled down a huge tome and handed it to me. The collected works of Ossenfelder, Berger, von Goethe, Coleridge, Byron, Polidori, Reimer, Le Fanu, and Stoker. I looked at it and shook my head. Sighing, I said, "I've read all of these. I'm looking for something more practical." Again, he seemed to study me with those brown eyes as his bushy eyebrows knit closely together. "Practical?" he asked. "We are talking about legend, boy. There's nothing practical about Phantasmagoria." I nodded and tried to be polite. I got the feeling I was undergoing some kind of test. The problem was that I was on a deadline. If I took too long, I'd never make it back in time for the last ferry to Colonial Bay. "I mean something scholarly," I told him. "Something that might be anthropological in nature." He chuckled and said, "Anthropological? Now that's a big word for one so young." He seemed to think for a moment and took me down yet another aisle full of books, and this time he pulled something from one of the lower shelves and handed it to me. It wasn't quite so large nor so well bound. It reeked of dust and disuse. But my other sight told me that there was some taint of magic to it. I opened it to find the title page, "A Metaphysical Study of the Aether and the Manipulations of the Physical World and the Body," by J. Williamson. I ran my finger along the silvered script and felt a slight tingle along my arm. There was a charm built into the book, with silver as the major component. I looked over to see the store owner staring at me expectantly, his hand in his coat pocket. I serendipitously sniffed the air and smelled of gun oil and silver coming from his direction. I smiled and ran my finger along the ward and nodded, and then looking at him I asked, "Did I pass your test?" Without taking his hand from his pocket, he backed away slowly and gave me the strangest look. "Exactly what are you?" he asked. "I am my father's son," I told him. "I stand between humanity and those that would free and chain." I quoted our commission given to us by Freya. "You are not entirely human?" he asked. I shook my head and said, "No, my mother is at Alpha." His eyes seemed to bulge at the knowledge. "Nordic elves! But you crossed cold iron to get in here." I raised an eyebrow and asked, "Am I unwelcome in here?" Putting the book down on the shelf, I raised my hands. "I'm not here to hurt you. I found this place and hope to find information on vampires. The small town where I live is being plagued by one. I was looking for information on the best way to get rid of her." "Why would one such as yourself want to get rid of a vampire?" he asked slowly, retreating so that the counter was between us. Because she threatens the lives and livelihood of the town," I said, moving towards the door, suddenly having a very bad feeling about this place. "And why should that bother one of the dark breed?" he asked. And there was the term I'd yet to encounter. Dark breed. I questioned, reaching for the door, and suddenly I found it locked. I looked back at him and put my hands down at my side. "Look, I don't mean you or anyone else any harm, but you're starting to worry me that you're about to do something unwise. If you just let me out the door, then I'll be on my way and won't bother you again." Again, his eyes narrowed. "What are you?" he asked again. I felt something brush against my mind shields, something far less powerful than Lucy's own mental abilities. It reminded me of some of the minor chi abilities I'd encountered in a few very advanced martial artists, and the occasional dabbler of the mystic arts. His will was powerful enough to reach across the room, but it was ineffective against my own natural training. I shook my head and said, "I'm out of here." I reached for the door and felt the knob burn in my hand. I ignored the brief flash of pain and twisted the handle completely to the right. Putting my other hand against the frame, I pulled.
and with a loud popping, the handle, the plate, the entire lock came out of the door. I dropped the crumpled mess to the floor, reached into my pockets and dropped a $10 bill with it. That's for the damage. I strode out into the gathering darkness, cursing my luck for what had just happened. Sliding behind the wheel of my LaSalle, I realized that I was not going to make it to the ferry on time. I was going to have to either wait it out in DC or drive all the way to Richmond and then loop back to Colonial Bay. I decided an overnight stay in the nation's capital wasn't such a bad idea, and I knew exactly where to stay. Chapter 5. Let's get straight into that. I spent the night at the Mayflower in DC. In my own time, it was the oldest hotel in the city, but in 1928, it was only 3 years old and was the height of luxury and elegance. The food was good, the service was excellent, and the beds were comfortable, and I spent most of the time there simply reading. I left early the next morning and made it back to Colonial Bay by 9 o'clock, only to find a worried-looking George sitting on my front porch. As I climbed the stairs, the first words out of his mouth were, "Where have you been?" "The capital," I told him. "I missed the ferry and I don't know the roads well enough to try and drive to Richmond and then back here. What's wrong?" "Eddie," he said. "He's been attacked." "What?" I asked. "Where? When?" "Last night. We were all leaving one of the local diners in Maple Grove when we were attacked. The guy was unbelievably strong. He tossed us around like limp wash rags. I got hit in the head, and when the stars finally cleared, Eddie, he was laying on the ground and was bleeding from the neck." I started cursing in Old Norse as we opened the front door and we went in. I felt a tingle at the wards I set up in the house. Something had tried to enter, but hadn't gotten past them. Something supernatural, because they wouldn't have stopped a human. Finally, I looked at him and asked, "Where is he now?" "The hospital. The doctor said that he's lost a lot of blood, but should make it," George said worriedly. "Yeah, he'll make it long enough to be in that vampire's control. And then when he does die, he'll become one of them. We have to find that one and put an end to him." Something in my tone must have bothered him because his face drained of color. "I can't toss off killing people as easily as you do, Win." "I'm not talking about killing people, George. They're already dead. They have no pulse. The only body heat they have comes from the blood they drain from the living. And they create more like them by killing the people they drain. Eddie is in far more danger now than he would be in the middle of a war." I stopped and asked, "How are the others taking it?" "Not good. Betty's in near hysterics and Long John is blaming himself for letting Eddie come along. Dot's about to chew nails though. I think she's kinda sweet on Eddie." I laughed at him and told him, "You guys really don't understand women, do you? Of course, she's sweet on Eddie. They've both got the same kind of inquisitive mind." "Dot's got an inquisitive mind?" George asked. I gave him a long look and then nodded. "I hate to break this to you, George, but women are people too. I know they just got their vote and all, but they're people too, and they have lots of loves and likes and hates just like you do. They just express them differently. Right now, Dot's probably the most dangerous one of us all, and is likely to be in the most danger as well. We got to find that vampire and put an end to him permanently, or we will lose Eddie and probably Dot too." I put my keys on the board and started walking through each room around the outer walls of the house, looking for where the area where something had tried to breach the ward. I finally found it at the door to the cellar. I reached out and touched the door and felt it was ice cold. Whatever had tried to come in was still down there. I nodded towards George and held my hands out in a wait here motion. I slipped back into the main living room
and to the altar I had set up and grabbed the hammer I used the other night in the woods. I also picked up my bag of stakes and grabbed the Civil War era cavalry saber that I used to holler the V for worship when I blessed the hammer. It wasn't a very good sword. The tang at the end of the hilt was loose. It was just something I'd picked up in an antique shop while out shopping, but it did the job until I could get a better one. And coming back, I noticed that George had a crucifix out and was holding it. I smiled, handed him the saber, and pulled the door open. And immediately, both the hammer and the crucifix began to glow with a soft white light. I reached out and flipped the light switch and watched the 100-watt iridescent bulb flare into a harsh light, overpowering and drowning out the light of the hammer and the crucifix. Below, I could hear something and someone scramble to the cellar. The smell that was wafting up was one of death and decay. I looked back over at George, who was obviously remembering the events that night coming from Lucy's. He swallowed hard and nodded. I noticed his knuckles on the saber were almost stark white. I led the way downstairs, noticing the scratch marks and burns on the inside of the door. Those wards were designed to draw heat from one section of an object and concentrate it onto another. Evidently, I needed to extend my wards further down in the house. As I stepped off the landing, I listened to the sounds of someone scurrying back into the hidden room I discovered not long ago. I walked over to the wall and put my hand on the shelf that hid the door. Looking back at George, I nodded again and motioned that the door would swing outward. He looked a little surprised and then nodded, and with a quick touch with my shoe, I pushed the little force foot back and heard the click of the locking mechanism. As the whole shelf swung outward towards George, I heard movement in the other room, and with a guttural sound, a dark form flashed out of the room towards poor George. I reacted instinctively and lashed out with a side kick. I felt it connect with his body and watched as he was hurled across the basement and into the far wall. He hit it like a shot, slid down the wall, and lay stunned for a second, holding his ribs. If he'd been human, or at least mortal, then he'd been dead or close to it. I took a moment to study him carefully. He was short and stocky, obviously built for strength and power. Barely clearing 5.5 feet, he was almost as broad as he was tall. His hair was dark brown and his eyes were blue. He had the classical nose that was considered the height of aristocracy in Britain during the Victorian era. As he stumbled to his feet, his eyes blazed a sickly yellow and darted between George holding a crucifix in one hand and the sword in the other, and me standing there with a hammer. He flashed his fangs and growled as he began advancing on me, not seeming to recognize the hammer in my hand as being as much of a threat to him as the crucifix. I drew the hammer back and as if to swing, and he rushed me. I felt the vice-like grip grab my wrist to hold the hammer at bay while the other latched down on my left forearm. He launched his face forwards towards mine, and I ducked my chin and lashed out with a powerful head butt. Not letting go, he jerked his head back and I shook it as if to clear away the lights that had been dancing before his eyes. Up close, I could smell his breath, dank and fetid like rotting flesh. It turned my stomach. I twisted so my body was between him and George, and then I flashed my own fangs at him. I could feel the tiger begin to take hold of my personality as Freya's commission exerted herself. And this creature, this vampire, was a threat to the humans around me and had to be dealt with. And with a grim smile, I twisted my free hand around to grasp his forearm and began to squeeze slowly, as I slowly brought the hammer down towards his face. He seemed to sense the danger as the head of the weapon began to glow with the same white light as George's crucifix. He looked up at the descending symbol of Midgarth's water, and his eye grew wide with terror and discomfort. Now he was pushing with all of his might to hold it away from his face. He tried to pull his other hand away from mine to use it, but was unable to break free, and with a quick yank, I lifted him off the floor and set him back down so that he was now between George and me.
and over his shoulder I could see my friend advancing the saber in his hand drawn back for a thrust, terror etched in his eyes. As I brought the hammer inexorably down towards the vampire's face, he began to squirm and twist, trying to get away from the glowing tool, and suddenly his body stiffened as I felt the blade of the saber slice into my shirt and bounce off my skin. In his fear and panic, George had put all of his weight behind the thrust, and it went clean through the vampire's body, and with a scream of rage, he tried to twist out of my hands to grab a hold of the foot of the steel sticking out of his chest. I forced the hammer down into his face and could see the smoke rising from the burning dead flesh as he collapsed to his knees. I let go of him, and his hands went to his burned face, trying to stop the pain. I quickly switched hands with the hammer and reached behind him and grabbed the hilt of the blade. In a single motion, I drew it from his body, stepped to one side, spun, and brought the blade down against the back of his neck. Now, don't let anyone tell you that it's easy to remove a limb with a single stroke of a blade, especially one as worn and as dull as the saber in my hand. Most historians will tell you that the reason the guillotine was invented was because even a swordsman or axeman sometimes had to make more than one stroke to execute someone whose head was on the block. It is said that the headsman had to chase Mary Queen of Scots around the courtyard just to finish her off after his first stroke failed to kill her. But when you can't exert enough force to toss a bulldozer, it's somewhat easier. And with the sound of a wooden bucket hitting the ground, the vampire's head toppled to the floor as the blade buried itself into the concrete. Much to my surprise, like in the movies, the body began to decay before our very eyes. Like time-lapse photography, it bloated, and then the flesh began to decay and melt away, and in less than a minute it was reduced to a black and fragile skeleton. I looked up to see George backing away from me, a worried expression upon his face. "Your eyes, your ears," he said with fear obvious in his voice. I reached up and touched the tiger ears on top of my head and realized that I'd given myself away. I closed my eyes and wheeled my body back into a human form. I watched George's look of astonishment as I became a little more human. "It's all right, George. I'm not going to hurt you." What are you?" he asked. I shrugged and said, "I am a man." He shook his head and said, "No, not a normal man." I shook mine and replied, "No, not a normal man. Would you believe that I am an agent of a divine force sent to protect the world from these kind of creatures?" I gestured towards the vampire. He looked over at the blackened skeleton at my feet and then back up at me. "At this point, I believe almost anything." And with a trembling sigh, he sat down on the steps as the adrenaline rush slowly drained from his body, making him weak. "I don't understand what's going on. Agent of a divine force? You got damn cat ears and eyes." I smiled and pulled the saber from where it was embedded in the concrete and handed it to him, hilt first. I figured he might feel the need of some kind of protection from me, and if it made him feel better, then it was the least I could do. "I got more than just ears and eyes, but that's not important. I'm not going to hurt you or your friends. I'm here to help you. I'm sort of a feline factor on Earth." "What divine force?" he asked. "Not God?" I smiled and shook my head. "No, not your God." He looked at the hammer in my left hand and said, "That's what you meant by the hammer not working for me." I nodded and sat down at a table across the room from him. "It's a symbol of my faith. You know, it's a free country, when it comes to religion." "Never heard of a religion that used a hammer for a divine symbol," he said. I smiled and told him, "It's very old. It was in Europe before Christianity ever came. It was the faith of the Vikings. It's where you get most of your Christmas and Easter traditions, and the days of the weeks are named for my gods." "Thor?" he asked. Is that who sent you?
I nodded and said, yes, Thor. Thor is one of my gods, but he is not who sent me. And I'd really rather not reveal too much. The more you know, the more danger you could be in.
I'd say we're already in a great deal of danger. I mean, Eddie was attacked and now you? He told me.
I nodded and said, yeah, Eddie was attacked, but when people like Lucy figure out that I'm more than what I appear to be, they're going to come after me harder, and some of them may go after my friends to find out what they know. Then thinking back to my reception at the bookstore, I added, and I'm not so sure how some people on this side of the fence are going to feel about me.
What do you mean? He asked, looking up.
I could see his pupils shrinking back to normal size as his breathing and heart rate began to slow. The shake was starting to leave his shoulders. Yesterday, I had an encounter with someone who was convinced that I was one of the bad guys. I barely made it out of the place without having to hurt somebody, I told him.
You worry about hurting other people or other people getting hurt a lot, don't you? He asked. Are you afraid of losing control?
I smiled and shook my head. No, I'm not afraid of losing control. I was born the way I am and have been controlling it since I was old enough to walk and to sharpen my claws on my mum's drapes. It's part of me, like an arm or a leg. I worry about hurting other people because I have a great deal of power, and if I'm not careful how I use it, then someone could get hurt. It has been said that with great power comes great responsibility. I believe that because I live it every day.
Exactly. What kind of power? He asked.
I smiled and said, it's best that you don't know everything. I'm stronger than a normal man. I'm harder to hurt and my senses are keener. I have other abilities too, but those are the kinds of things that tend to worry the good Catholic boys like you. But you should know that, like I said before, I won't hurt you or your friends. I let him sit and think about what I had said as I gathered up the remains of the vampire and thought carefully about what had happened.
That's the second person you've killed in less than a week, he said.
I grinned back over at him and said, you're the one who ran a saber through his chest. Besides, like I said upstairs, he was already dead. He just hadn't got a good sense to lie down. I pointed at the bones that were already turning to dust. Would you say that that is the body of a man only recently dead? He shook his head and said,
no, it's not. And you're right. I did stick this thing through him.
He held the gleaming blade up and looked at it saying,
why isn't there any blood on it?
Because vampires use blood differently than you or me. Their bodies turn it into a black ichor-like substance that sustains them. And when they die, then it becomes the same kind of dust as the vampire does, I said, shrugging. That's it for the vampires I know about. Some of these seem to be different. The one the other night didn't turn to dust like this. I stopped and thought for a moment. Finally turning to him, I asked, did you recognize him? He shook his head and said,
no, I've never seen him before in my life.
I nodded my head and stroked the stubble on my chin. I had forgotten my razor and had had a chance to shave back in DC. I briefly wondered how growing a beard would go over in the 1920s. Or maybe it's because the one I killed the other night was nearly undead and therefore its body hadn't had as many years to keep at bay. This one could be older and therefore more susceptible to the years its body was holding off with the blood of the living.
You have the strangest ways of putting things, Win,
George said, rising from the stair and putting the sword tip down next to his foot while resting his palm on its hilt. I smiled at that. My grandfather would have given me tongue lashings for mistreating a sword that way, but then again, he was after all a very talented swordsmith in Alfheim. Blame it on my upbringing. I grew up shutting my time between Alfheim and Sweden. I speak close to 20 languages, so I tend to come at ideas from a lot of different perspectives. And shaking my head and pointing at the now pile of dust, I asked, this isn't the one who attacked Eddie, is it?
No, he said, shaking his head. "The guy who attacked Eddie, I've seen around town before." "Where?" I asked him. "He's one of the dock workers up at the north end of town," he told me. "I don't know his name, I've just seen him around the docks." I gave him an arched eyebrow and asked, "What are you doing around the docks?" "My old man works up there," he told me. "He's a stevedore for the fuel dump." I nodded as I picked up the broom and the dustpan and started to casually sweep up the ashes. "Hand me that trash can, would you?" I nodded towards a can sitting next to the stairs. He gave me a strange look but handed it to me nonetheless. "Isn't that a little disrespectful to the dead?" he asked. I shrugged and said, "I'm just going to take it down to the shore and spread them on the winds. I could always simply flush them down the toilet." He shook his head and said, "Win, you can be hard sometimes, you know that?" "I live in a hard world. This vampire tried to kill you and me and turn us into one of him. I have no remorse in putting him down. That's my job." It was the job my father did before me, and the job of my ancestors dating back to before the Roman Empire. It'll be the job of my children, and their children's children, I told him. Since he was beginning to learn what I am, then he might as well get used to dealing with the fact that I am bound by a code much stricter than anything he could ever imagine. 10 minutes later, and a trip down the bootlegger's tunnel, and the deed was done. I grabbed a quick change of clothes and a shave, and we headed over to the hospital where Eddie was. I could tell what room he was in based on the general complaining I was hearing from it. Having sensitive ears at times can be a real blessing. Actually, a Magecat's enhanced senses were both a blessing and a curse at times, especially the sense of smell. Memory is linked closely to smell, and let's face it, some people just stink, literally. In the hospital, it was the tincture of iodine that was burning at my olfactory senses. But in this case, I could hear Eddie complaining about having to stay in bed. It once again brought home how much out of time I was. This was an era where doctors prescribed bed rest a whole lot more than they did in my own. George and I knocked on the door and entered. I could see Dot was already in the room and was trying to get him to go back into bed. I grinned at him and said, "If I had a pretty girl trying to coax me into bed, I don't think I'd be fighting her that much, Eddie." And suddenly Dot glared at me, but I could see the faint signs of amusement behind her eyes as well. "That was uncalled for, Win," she said. I bowed my head and said, "1,000 apologies, Dot. I was just trying to put some humour into a situation." Eddie, on the other hand, was suddenly looking at Dot in a whole new light. I nodded my head slightly to where he was staring at her, and she caught his reflection in the mirror. The look on his face was one of surprise. I could see the beginning of a smile on her face. Eddie wasn't as in the dark as the rest of the boys about Dot. "Hi, fellas," he finally said. "I heard you lost a fight with something that tried to eat you," I told him. "Well, that's one way of putting it," he said, climbing back into bed to free up the chairs. "I didn't believe what George told us. I should have, though." I nodded and replied as I scooted one of the chairs around for Dot to sit on as a peace offering. Right now we just need to find the guy. There was no use in telling him that I was planning on separating the vampire's head from his shoulders and then destroying the body so it could never return. No need to scare them any more than they already were. "I have a question though, Win. You seem to be an expert on these things. At least that's what George tells us," Dot said. I shrugged and told her, "I know a few things, but what I don't know is a whole lot more than what I do know. But ask your question and I'll do what I can." I had an idea of where she was going with this, but I was going to let her get there herself. These boys needed to learn that women given half a chance could and would think for themselves. "Is Eddie in any more danger than just from blood loss?" she asked. I could see the worry in her eyes. I could hear it in the half-octave rise in her voice. She had evidently at least read the stories, or the one which most Americans in the 1920s were familiar with. And since the Lugosi film wasn't due out for another 5 years or so, and she was at least getting a little better information than what would come out later. I looked over at George and he nodded to me. I was not going to sugarcoat it for them. They were in serious danger, not only physically but spiritually as well. And finally, looking back at her, I said, very possibly. If we don't deal with a vampire who did this, then he could be in a great deal of danger, or even be dangerous to his friends. Depending on how strong his attacker is, he can use the connection he has forged with Eddie to take over his mind, and force him to do things that he would not normally do. And if Eddie were to die without first dealing with his attacker, then he is likely to become one of them. I stopped and looked at Eddie and said, "Please don't take this the wrong way, big fella. I know you can whip your weight in snarks, but this is something more than physical." I turned to Dot and said, "If he starts asking you to do things that don't make any sense, or if he tries to kiss you, especially at night, don't do it. And don't let him. Not at least until I had a chance to find his attacker and deal with him." "How do you plan to deal with him?" Dot asked. I noticed that Eddie wasn't protesting, and that suggested that he might already be filling the pool of his attacker's mind. Again, I looked over at George. I wasn't sure how the others would feel about the level of violence I can and will bring to bear on a situation. George seemed to be at a loss for answers. He simply shrugged at me, and so I turned back to her and said, "Like I told George earlier, he's already dead, he just hasn't realized it yet. I tend to make him realize it." I could see a brief vengeful smile flicker across the blonde's eyes. This girl was definitely made for stronger stuff than anyone around her gave her credit for. She reached out and squeezed Eddie's hand and asked, "How can we help?" I sighed and said, "I'd like if someone, preferably two someone, stayed with Eddie from the hours of sunset and sunrise. And just make sure that nobody comes in who isn't supposed to, and that he doesn't go any further than the toilet." Again, I looked over at George and said, "Someone with some kind of connection to a faith, either baptism or just a strong faith, as well as a symbol of that faith, would be at best." "Like a priest?" she asked. I shrugged and told her, "It doesn't have to be a priest, just somebody who believes in the faith." "He's right," George said. "It worked for me at his house." "What are you talking about, George?" Eddie asked. I gave George a quick glance, didn't want the news of my killing the older vampire to escape just yet. He shook his head and said, Just trust me. You don't have to be a priest, you just have to believe, and I think after last night, all of us believe." Dot nodded, but I could see her baby blue eyes dart back to me. It was clear that she wasn't about to let the question die completely, but she also knew when and where to fight her battles. My respect for this girl was going up immensely. "Yeah, we believe. I'll stay with Eddie. I'm sure my parents won't object as long as someone else will stay with me. Maybe Jimmy." I shook my head. Something told me that Jimmy was the wrong person for this particular job. I had only met him once, but I'm usually a pretty good judge of people's character. And Jimmy was an okay enough guy and all, but he seemed just a little too withdrawn, too depressed. Eddie needed someone with a little less fatalistic outlook on life, especially considering what he was facing. I was thinking about taking Jimmy and George with me. "How about John?" I suggested. Dot seemed to be thinking the same thing I was. "Good idea. I'll call him. I'm sure it'll be okay if he stays over." "Just whatever you do, don't let Eddie out of your sight. And if you get a strange urge that doesn't seem to make sense to you, don't entertain it. Tell the other person and fight it," I told them. "There's a whole lot more to this." Eddie paused a moment as he adjusted his pillow. "And you, than appears, isn't there?" I smiled and nodded. I got the feeling that he and Dot were really the smartest two out of this bunch. I nodded and said, "Yeah, there is, but the less you know about that, the safer you're likely to be. Just ask George." George nodded and gave a wan smile. "Trust me, guys, he knows what he's talking about, and you don't want to know." I chuckled and told them,
I wouldn't go so far as to say I know what I'm talking about. I just know a little more than you guys, I told him as I looked down at my watch. Look, I want to check some things out before tonight. I need to get out of here. Give John a call and keep George informed. George, if you don't mind, see if you can get in touch with Jimmy. I'd like you two to help me pick out the guy who attacked Eddie. I don't want to make any mistakes here. He nodded and asked, well, how can I get in touch with you? I thought for a moment and finally decided on a perfect place for a rendezvous. Well, how about the ice cream shop at 3? If I don't hear from you, I'll figure something has happened to you and come looking for you to make sure you're safe. Well, he's a big boy, Win. He can take care of himself, Eddie said. I smiled over at him and said, still, I'd like to make sure my friends are safe. It's what I do. And just like you have to make sure that everybody knows you can take care of yourself. As I got up to leave, he chuckled and said, okay. I went back to my house and resealed the wards, this time extended them all the way down to the tunnel. When everything had settled down, I really needed to do a proper land taking on the property so that I could seal it all. But for now, this would do. After resetting the wards, I started backtracking the vampire. I followed the tracks to a small cove that cut into the property, and there I found where a boat had come to a shore, and a second set of tracks around the area where evidently the vampire had disembarked. I briefly wondered if the second set of tracks meant that he could not cross water under his own power. Somehow, I doubted it. It did, however, create something of a problem for me. I couldn't track him any farther. The water wouldn't carry the scent, and boats don't leave tracks. Frustrated, I headed back home. I needed to find out where the vampire was based. I suspected that Lucy would like to keep her forces close at hand. They might be staying at her place, but now that she knows that we know what she is, that would not be a wise course of action. I got the impression that Miss West was much smarter than most people gave her credit. Something told me that she was definitely a woman ahead of her time. I simply wished there was some way of dealing with her the way it was done back in my home reality. The agreement, commonly known as the Covenant, would go a long way in smoothing out this situation. But I got a feeling that it wouldn't work here. It took someone willing to be ruthless in its enforcement, and I was just one man. I couldn't cover the whole world. I cut across the property to get back to the house. I wanted a chance to see some of the land that was mine. I needed to get to know if I was going to claim it. It was actually a very large piece of property, and I knew I was eventually going to have to take the time to walk it. And there was quite a bit of coastline property as well as the wooded areas. I took the walk home rather slowly, just enjoying getting a feel for the land of Vatir here. Having a good relationship with the spirits of the land is always a good idea for any will worker. If that relationship is good enough, the very spirits themselves would rise up to defend the people, like happened in Iceland. It was nearing 2 o'clock by the time I got home, and my stomach was telling me it was time to eat. As I entered the backyard, I spied a black sedan sitting across the street. And there was a man sitting behind the wheel that was paying an awful lot of attention to my side door for someone who was trying to appear to be asleep. My God, how was it I was attracting so much attention? I shrugged and decided to deal with it as it came. There was no use starting a brawl in the street. I unlocked my side door to my house and went on in, not worrying about it. As I entered the house, I cast my senses out. I may not worry about it, but I wasn't going to be stupid. Someone else had already tried to invade my house once, and so I wasn't taking any chances. After a few seconds, I could tell I was alone. Nothing besides me was breathing inside the place. I had told Mrs. McCain that I may not be home last night, so not to worry if she came in and found me gone this morning. I told her I was out looking for colleges in the DC area, and that should have covered for me being gone for a while if I needed it. I took the lid off the round cake cover sitting on the table and found a stack of homemade biscuits and a bowl of fried sausage patties. Checking the fridge revealed a pitcher of sweet tea, the perfect lunch. Hey,
I may have been raised in Sweden, but my dad was an Alabama boy from way back. As far as my family was concerned, this was good eats. About the time I settled into my first sausage and biscuit, there was a knock at the door. I should have known better. I set the glass of tea in the fridge, covered my plates, and went out to check it. And when I pulled back the curtain to peer out, I saw a tall man with a head of thick black hair and deep blue eyes. He looked to be in his mid-30s and was whipcord thin. He was dressed in an expensive dark three-piece suit and had a black fedora in one hand and what looked like a cane in the other. I could smell the silver on the latter through the door. I opened it and said neutrally, "Hello." He smiled and looked me up and down. I could feel more than just his eyes reaching out to take my measure. Something seemed to probe at my mind and my very soul. "My name is Joseph Drew. Are you the young man who was in Dunstan's Bibliothèque and Antiquities yesterday afternoon?" I looked him up and down again and said, "As a matter of fact, I am. I can't say much for the service or the hospitality of the place, and I'm not likely to recommend it to my friends or acquaintances any time in the near future." I did not, however, open my door any wider. I didn't fully trust anyone from that store right now. "What can I do for you, Mr. Drew?" He nodded and said, "I apologize for that. You startled the clerk and he did not react well." I smiled and asked, "Would you mind telling me how you found me, Mr. Drew?" "If I could come in, maybe we could discuss it," he said. "I was just about to head out to a little restaurant in town for late lunch, Mr. Drew. If you would like to join me, we could discuss it there," I told him. It wasn't entirely the truth, but after the recent attempts of incursion, I wasn't about to let someone I didn't know inside my wards, especially if they were representing a person or group who'd recently tried to trap me. I also wanted everything out in the open where he was more likely to stay on his best behaviour. He seemed to consider the offer. I knew that he was thinking about the same thing I was, and he smiled and said, "Well, if you would let me buy your meal as some sort of small recompense for the way you were mistreated, maybe we can discuss it. The people with whom I work are genuinely interested in fighting others with similar goals as ours." I nodded and said, "Very well," I said. "I could at least listen to what you have to say." As I came out onto the porch, he backed away, putting the cane to the ground to support his weight. I noticed then that he had a severe limp. 15 minutes and 2 cars later, we were sitting at a little table in the back section of a local restaurant awaiting our meals. It wasn't far from the ice cream shop, so I could get there on time. "Exactly what can I do for you, Mr. Drew?" I asked. "You told Martin, our clerk, that you were having problems with a vampire. We are curious as to what would make you think that such a creature really exists." I smiled at him and said, "You mean besides the fact that I've already dealt with 2 locally, met a 3rd, and a group of my friends was attacked by a 4th? The fact that your bookstore is covered in mystical wars to hide its true nature, and both you and your friend Martin carry firearms with silver rounds, and your cane has a silver core, probably the plated blade? You at least believe in lycanthropes, if not vampires. Martin himself attempted a crude form of telepathy or mesmerism against my mind, and you smell of magical wards and a talisman, Mr. Drew." He chuckled to himself. "You have a keen nose and mind, mister." He suddenly realized that he had failed to get my name. "Greenbow," I said. "Win Greenbow." An unusual name," he told me. "It serves its purpose," I replied. He asked, "Exactly what are you, Mr. Greenbow?" I leaned back in my chair and shook my head. You first." And grinning, he stopped talking while our waitress brought over our drink orders. After she was out of earshot, he said, "I represent a group of scholars, investigators, wanderers, or just plain adventurers who've made it to our goal to protect the world from the influence of the dark breed. We call ourselves the Recondite Order." "I've never heard of you," I said. We are what's left of a war with an organization once called the Directive. We split off from them when they started dabbling in sorcery and recruiting werewolves as a way of supplementing their powers in the battle against the dark breed, he told me. Eventually, we were forced to destroy them at the end of the 18th century. That would explain the differences in realities. In my home reality, the Directive's power wasn't broken until the beginning of the 21st century. I nodded and said, I've heard of the Directive. Nasty bunch of sorcerers who were bent on destroying anyone that was not part of their power structure. He raised an eyebrow and said, Where would you have heard of such an organization? Because it's my commission to stand between humanity and those that were free and chained, Mr. Drew. My family has been dealing with nocturnal forces that would threaten mankind for the last 8,000 years, I told him. Who gave you such a commission? He asked. Let's just call it a divine being and leave it at that. I found that some people around here start getting nervous and trigger happy when their favourite religious beliefs are challenged, I said as I nodded to where the waitress was coming with our meals. We both sat quietly until the meatloaf and mashed potatoes were delivered and the waitress left, and finally he broke the silence. My organization works closely with certain factors inside the church. Perhaps we could be of service to each other. I stayed neutral at this mention of the church. My mother still had a grudge because of Charlemagne's execution of 6,000 Saxons for refusing to convert. And she was there at the time and barely escaped with her life. Me, I was at least willing to listen, even though I was more inclined to follow my mum's lead. I shrugged and told him, Several of my friends were attacked last night. Some of us are going after the vampire who did it this evening, and afterward we're going after the queen vampire. You're welcome to come along. If he was going to offer help, let's see how far he would go. He raised an eyebrow at the invitation and then nodded. Okay, tell me what's going on. I can call my people and get some help. Although if the lead vampire is a woman, I don't see the need for much help. I shook my head at him and said, How did you ever live this long? What is it with people around here underestimating women? You think she is dangerous? He asked. I think she's probably more dangerous than you give her credit for, I told him. Tell me about her, he said. And so I did. I left out the parts about using my cat form and my other gifts, but he got the picture. I knew that he was looking at things from a skeptic's eye, and that was okay. He was at least getting the picture. This woman was real, and she was dangerous. He sat back and listened to my tale and then nodded. Okay, how about I go with you tonight to deal with this vampire that attacked your friend? And afterward, we can go visit Miss West's house. I nodded and told him. Okay. Checking my watch, I added, We need to hurry. I'm supposed to meet George in half an hour. He grinned and dug into the rather good meatloaf. The meeting with George went surprisingly well. He had recruited Jimmy like I'd asked, and both boys were waiting for us as we arrived at the ice cream parlour. Introductions were made, and we settled into one of the back booths for a council of war. We decided that we would go to the docks tonight, where the sun would be well and down, and the vampires would have a chance to actually be there. We weren't sure if this guy would keep his night job after becoming a vampire, but it was worth checking out. And boy did we get more than we bargained for. As we were preparing to leave, George and Jimmy pulled me aside as Joseph headed to use the payphone outside the ice cream shop. How much should we trust this guy? Jimmy asked. I could tell that he knew I was uncomfortable with Drew. I smiled at him and said, I'm not entirely sure. I met one of his colleagues the other day in DC, and he was none too pleasant. Joe, I think, is supposed to smooth that over. We'll watch and we'll see. I stopped a moment and said, However, if he or his friends put any of our friends in danger, we do what has to be done. Understood? Both boys nodded and grinned darkly.
George started to say something, but I held up a hand. I wanted to hear the conversation Drew was having on the phone. The guy has made contact and claims to have neutralized 2 out of the 4 vampires he's confirmed are in the town. I believe him. We are going to deal with the 3rd after sundown tonight. After that, we are going after the nest. I want you to send the monks to meet us at the nest. It's the last house on Stony Knoll Drive in Colonial Bay, he told his contact.
Are you sure about this, Drew? I mean, that guy had Shifter written all over him.
I recognized Martin's voice on the other end of the line. No, I'm not sure about it, but my gut tells me to go with him, Drew said.
Well, if he's a Shifter, you've got your sword and your Navy Colt. Haven't met a Shifter yet who could stand up to the silver 45 round to the head or heart,
Martin told him.
And I'll make sure the monks are armed with silver rounds as well.
Just remember to tell them that this is my mission, not theirs. They follow my orders this time, or I'll be taking some of them out with the vampires, Drew told him. I could almost see Martin's uneasiness on the other end of the phone.
These guys don't accept outside command very well. You know that, Drew. They are totally dedicated to the eradication of all taint of the dark breed. You might be better off just getting out of their way and letting them do their job.
I could see Joe's face from this distance, and the look on it was one of pure disgust. It was that look as well as his reply that told me that even though I couldn't trust the recondite order, I could at least count on Drew in a fight. Like what happened in Guadalajara? I don't think so. No more innocents getting hurt, or I'm going to start taking the ones that are involved out along with a dark breed. Make sure they understand that, Martin. No innocents get hurt. Martin's voice took on a lecturing tone.
You know that they consider anyone tainted by the dark breed not to be innocent.
I don't give a crap about that, Drew cut him off. Nobody but the vampires goes down, or the order is going to be short of a few monks. Make sure they understand that.
I will. They won't like it, but I'll tell them, Martin said.
Good, Drew told him. If everything goes well, I will see you tomorrow. He then hung up. Returning my attention to George and Jimmy, I said, just keep an eye on this so-called assistance he's sending. They sound none too trustworthy. If one of them comes at you, do what has to be done. Both boys smiled and nodded. I pointed to the bag in the back seat of the Lascelles. There's some weapons and tools in there that should be effective against vampires. I'm sorry, I couldn't get any holy water. That's going to make our job much harder. And Jimmy stuck his head in the car and rummaged through the bag. There's nothing in this bag but some garlic and tomato steaks and a couple of crucifixes, he said. A stake through the heart is very effective against anything, Win, he told me. Yeah, but a sword or a bullet through the heart won't stop him. It'll just make him mad. Just ask George, I replied. George nodded his head and said, Trust me, I put a sword through the heart of the one in Win's basement and it didn't stop him. Jimmy gave us both a disbelieving stare before reaching into the back of his own jalopy and putting out a Louisville Slugger. He said, If you don't mind, I'll stick to what I know. I smiled and told him, Put a steak or 2 in your jacket pocket then. He started to protest and I said, Just humour me. If I'm wrong then, you won't need 'em, but if I'm right, then they'll be there. It's better to have them than not need them, than the other way round. He listened to my argument, nodded his head and finally complied, stuffing a steak into each side pocket of his jacket. For a second there, I thought he was going to be stubborn. And finally, he asked, What about silver bullets? Only work on shapeshifters, Joe said, coming up to the car and giving me a knowing look. I grinned back and said, Not all of those. And finally, I looked over at George and he seemed to realize what I was thinking. He nodded and I turned to the others inside and said, And if you see anything with cat ears and a tail, don't shoot it. You just make me mad. I looked over at Joe and said, Let's get something cleared up right now. Before you or my friends embarrass yourselves, silver doesn't affect me.
I like silver, so don't get any ideas. I pulled back my shirt sleeve to show him the Silverman's bracelet I had on my wrist. Both gave me a strange look and a nod. I could see Joseph's eyes widen just a little in fright as I pretty much cut his ace in the hole out of his sleeve. And finally he looked up and said, "I have a few vials of holy water in my car. Let me grab them." I nodded as I climbed into the car and waited. And George slid into the passenger seat and Jimmy got into the back. A few minutes later, Joseph joined him and closed the door, handing each of us a bottle of the water. I could see him watching me carefully as I took mine. I grinned at him and opened the bottle and sprinkled some of it on my wrist. When nothing happened, he looked at me strangely, and I asked, "What? You want me to take a swig of it?" He shook his head and said, "You really aren't dark breed, are you?" I laughed, shook my own head and started the car. As the engine roared to life, I said, "No, I'm not whatever this dark breed is. Now can we get down to a serious job and get in a vampire that attacked my friends?" I handed the bottle back to him. "You keep it," he told me. I shrugged and lay it in the car seat beside me. I didn't have a use for it, but it might come in handy for one of the others. A trip to the docks didn't take long. We picked up a spot off the main road where we could see cars passing, but not easily seen ourselves, and waited and watched. It was a long and mostly silent vigil, where each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew my comrades were psyching themselves up for what was to come. Me, I was pretty calm. Yes, vampires in great numbers could be a danger to me, but most of these were going to be damned vampires at the very outside best, if not Kinta or even Neos. And I don't think any of them were very old. Plus, there was the fact that this was what Freya had created me to do. And sometimes I wondered what it felt like not to have that calming sense of, this is what I do. What it was like to be uncertain in the world and not instinctively know your job. After about 3 hours of waiting, I turned to George and said, "You think he's probably there by now?" I saw him flinch at my breaking the silence. He grinned sheepishly at me and said softly, "If he's not there by now, I don't think he's going to be coming in." I nodded and started the engine and pulled out onto the road leading towards the docks. I was surprised at how easily we passed through to get to the fuel dump, but then realized that in the late 20s, people didn't yet fear terrorism. We drove around for about 10 minutes until George pointed to where there were several stevedores loading boxes onto the fishing boat. "There he is," he said. I looked over and realized that he wasn't much warmer than a cold January air. "You sure that's the one?" I asked. He nodded and said, "I remember the scar over his left eye." I looked at him and then back at George. "You got good eyes." He just grinned and said, "I eat a lot of carrots." I parked the car as we piled out. I looked at Jimmy and tossed him the keys. "I want you to stay with the car and keep the motor running. We may have to make a fast break out of here." He started to argue, but then realized that somebody really did have to stay with the car. "Okay," he said quietly. "Good man," I said. And we headed off towards the boat that was being loaded. I looked around and realized that he wasn't the only vampire here. I could literally feel that the boat was crawling with them. I stopped both George and Joe. "He's not alone." Before either could reply, the guy George had pointed out stood up and said, "No, I'm not." He turned to face us and then hopped down from the gunwale and started walking towards us. It was at this point that I saw several other large forms begin to step from the shadows, their body language making it clear they meant violence. "I am curious to know how you knew that, though. Miss West is very confused by the fact that she sent 2 people to kill you, and none of them have come back." I smiled at him and told him, "You know what they say, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I guess you and your friends are going to join them." "Not going to happen, boy. We got you outnumbered. We're not going to kill you." He looked over at Joe and George and added, "Well, not all of you at least. We're just going to tenderize you a bit before taking you to join your friends." "My friends?" I asked coolly, He nodded and said, "That tasty little scrapper I hid last night, his girlfriend, and that tall kid. Miss West has him at her place waiting on you." I looked at my friends and said, "Remember what I said about ears and the tail?" Turning back to him, I started letting the tiger come out to the front. "You just made a fatal error. You brought normals into this fight. You brought my friends into it. Now you meet the final death." I flicked my wrist and felt the small charm fall into my hands. "Vaxa!" I growled. I felt the great axe grow in my hand, and the vampire stepped back. There is a certain psychological advantage of approaching someone swinging an axe. On a gut level, it's more intimidating than even a sword. "Eldrir!" I growled again, and it burst into flames. And with this, all of the vampires stopped their advance. The big man began to circle me as his men spread out, obviously giving us both plenty of room. I heard a gun bark in the night, and felt something slam into my shoulder. I grinned at him and taunted. "What? Are you willing to lap it up off the ground like a dog instead of trying to drink from the spigot?" He stopped watching to see how I reacted to the gunshot. Finally realizing that he was not smelling blood, he asked in a low, gravelly voice, "What are you?" Joe and George were scrambling to take cover behind several crates that were stacked off to the side as another round slammed into the back of my head. Reaching up, I brushed the bullet from my hair, growled, and popped a claw. Drawing it across my forearm, I collected the blood I needed and cut the runes into the air. They blazed to life, suspended in a space between the vampire and myself as I sang in Old Norse. "The sixth I know, if harm one seeks, with a sapling's roots to send me. The hero himself, who wreaks his hate, shall taste the ill ere I." And then I sang the runes. "Dumb move, boy," the vampire said as we circled. "Blooding yourself around one of our kind is deadly." I nodded and hefted my axe. "And taking pot shots at a victor is even dumber," I growled. As if to drive my point home, the gun barked again, and this time it was followed by a scream and the sound of a body hit in the water. "My kind has been dealing with vampires who get out of line for the past 8,000 years." We continued to dance around each other as he stayed just out of my reach. Several times I felt his mind push against mine as he fainted in. It took me a moment to realize what he was trying to do. Not all vampires have enhanced speed. Instead, they make up for that by clouding their opponent's mind to make it appear that they are moving fast. It wasn't working on me. My mind shields kept him from being able to affect me. The worst part for him was that every time he did that, he was using some of the blood he'd recently taken from a victim. If he kept it up, he would run out. I waited until I felt his mind push against mine, and then, as he tried to dart in, I quickly stepped forward to meet him with a low swing of the axe. Ka-thunk! And with a blazing arc of fire and light, the blade sliced clean through his waist as the flames ate away at his body. His torso fell to the right, not quite realizing what had just happened, as his leg stood upright and he began to topple leftward. "Ugh!" He screamed in pain. It wasn't the cut that hurt him so much, it was the fire. Even I felt the soul wrenching from pain of the fire, despite the fact that it doesn't harm me. There are some advantages to the transhuman genes I got from Trey. I watched as the flames raced into the two halves of his body as he tried to crawl on his arms back to his legs. I stepped back and watched as he began to burn from the inside. As he went up in a pair of human pyres of flames and smoke, I turned to see what was happening with the others. George and Joe were back to back as the vampires had ceased their advance when their leader screamed in pain. I smiled to myself, roared and leapt at them. The sound echoed off the water and across the bay and seemed to free my friends from their own shock. And with a grim determination, we went to work. I landed amongst the three that were menacing poor George. A quick crescent kick shattered the pelvis of one in the middle, as my boot caught him high on the hip bone. As I sat down, I lashed out with a spike that struck out between the blades at the head of my axe and caught the one on the right of the side of the neck. He screamed too as the fire raced inside his body and set him ablaze. George spun on the last one and caught him with a solid strike in the middle of his chest. The sudden look of surprise on the vampire's face told me it was fatal as the wooden tomato stake pierced his heart. George reached to remove it, but I stopped him. "Don't. It'll just get better if you do." And with a flick of my wrist, I sent the vamp's head spinning into the black water of the Potomac. "That's better," I said as the body began to burn before my eyes. I then brought the axe around to where the one with the broken pelvis was trying to get up. Again, the axe arched out and the head rolled from its shoulders. I watched in fascination as the body and the head were engulfed in flames. I hadn't had much opportunity to hunt vampires in my own reality. Most were fairly well behaved and followed Vlad's covenant, so I had no reason to go after them. The one time when I was 9 that Trey had snuck me out to go vampire hunting, it was dealing with a nasty little guy who was using his band to cover going after underage kids, and we hadn't used our weapons, only our claws. I was a bit surprised at how well my axe was working. Trey may have his sword in stone, which is the bane of the transhuman villains around the world, but I think my axe works better against the undead. Looking over, I could see where Joe had the sword in his cane out and was wielding it with a deadly accuracy. Evidently the silver didn't necessarily hurt the vamps, but they still felt the pain of its cut, and it was cutting deep. 4 vampires were trying to work so that 3 would distract him, while 1 would dart in for the kill. It wasn't working. I nodded over at George as we both raced to Joe's defense. It was a short and brutal fight, and by the time it was over, there were 2 more bodies burnt by my axe, one whose face had been disintegrated by a vial of holy water, and one with a tomato stake through his chest. When I casually finished the last 2 off with my axe, no need to leave the bodies around to be found, and then heard the sounds of a struggling coming from the direction of the car. "Jimmy!" I said, taken off between rows of tall crates. I could kick myself for leaving him there. As I skidded around the corner, I saw one vampire holding his face as smoke and steam was rising from between his fingers and around his throat. Another was warily circling Jimmy, who had the busted handle of the Louisville Slugger in one hand and a half a bottle of holy water in the other. I took off towards the one menacing the dark-haired young man and roared again into the night. As I leapt, the vampire turned to see me charging. A sudden look of surprise followed by a chagrin flashed across his face as he looked down to see the handle of the bat sticking from his chest. Jimmy struck with lightning speed and precision, driving the sharp end of the broken bat home. The vampire collapsed as I tucked and rolled when I hit the ground. I came up with 2 quick sweeps of the axe, relieved the last 2 of the burden of their heads. "What the hell are you?" Jimmy demanded as he backed away from me slightly. "Stod for Brenner," I said in Old Norse as I watched the fire die from my axe. When it was completely out, I said, "Gira sma," and felt it shrink back to my wrist as a charm. Spreading my hands, I wheeled my ears and tail away. "I'm what I said I am. I'm a friend here to protect you and our friends." I think he was trying to ignore what had just happened. He nodded as George came running around the corner at full speed. In the distance I could see Joe hobbling along on his bad leg. Jimmy looked over to him and asked, "Did you get the guy who attacked Eddie?" George nodded and said, "Yeah, but we got another problem. He said that Lucy has Eddie darting Long John." I watched as Jimmy's eyes grew big. "Where?" "Evidently at her place," I said. "What are we gonna do?" he asked. "We are gonna go get our friends back and have it out with Lucy," I told him grimly. For the whole trip out to Lucy's, both Joe and Jimmy kept giving me wary looks. I could smell the fear and surprise out of both of them. And finally, I sighed and said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." "I thought you said you weren't a shifter," Joe asked as I pulled out onto the road. I said that silver wouldn't affect me. I'm not a traditional shifter. I have complete control of what I am, and what I do in whichever form I take, I told them. Is that why you and George were able to escape from Lucy's that first night? Jimmy asked. I nodded and said, yeah, cats can see very well at night. I was able to guide us through the woods until we were attacked by one of her freshly made vampires. I defended us, killed him, and we came home. Why didn't you tell us, George? Jimmy asked. Because it wasn't my secret to tell, the other boy said. We all have our secrets, and I feel it was best to leave them like they are unless one of us wants to tell them. You might be surprised, Jimmy, he said. You might be surprised, but none of them affect anybody else, so they're nobody's business. How'd you come to know him? Jimmy asked. George shrugged in the darkness and said, I don't know. I guess people trust me to tell things to. What's your concern, Joe? I asked, more worried about my friend's safety than my own. And through the rearview mirror, I could see his face deep in thought. I am concerned that I may have hooked up with a dark breed, he finally said. I shook my head and said, I don't know what a dark breed is. I know that I am not evil, if that's what you're thinking. I just serve a different force for good than you do, if that makes any sense. The Order teaches that even the disciplines that it operates learn in order to defeat the dark breed are tainted, he said. Well, the Order is wrong, George said with a surprising conviction. I've seen Wynn in a fight, and he's not one of the bad guys. He goes out of his way to make sure that innocent people don't get hurt. You've seen the evidence with your own eyes. Holy water doesn't hurt me, and neither did anything your friend threw at me in Washington, I told him. What's it gonna take? Me? Joe asked. Not much, really. The Order, however, is a different story. Some of its members are rather rabid about the dark breed. Exactly what is the dark breed? Jimmy asked. Anybody touched by a wielding of the power of evil, Satan, witchcraft, magic, or any number of dark forces, he said. I am not allied with your god or evil, I told him. My lady is far from evil. Lady? He asked. I nodded and said, Freya. I am one of hers. Norse goddess of love? He asked. We don't have gods and goddesses of this and that. That's a Christian concept. She's the Vanadis, one of the Elderkin, and the creator of what I am. She sent 9 of us to Mildgarth to stand between humanity and those that would free and chain. I told him, laying all my cards on the table. She's also the keeper of cats and the first chooser of the battle slain. I am only evil in the eyes of the church because I'm not Christian. But if you ask me, the argument could be turned around if I wanted. The church is evil because it's not Nordic. I shook my head and said, but we don't believe in that kind of garbage. That was rather harsh, don't you think, Wynn? George said. I could tell that I ruffled a few feathers with that last remark. I shook my head and said, I don't mean to be harsh, but I'm just dealing in reality. As far as I'm concerned, each and every person is welcome to believe in whatever deity they wish or none at all. But their right to believe as they want ends at my front yard. And they can cajole me, and they can argue with me, and they can simply live their lives as they see fit. But when they start coming at me with guns and bombs and swords, or worse, the power of the government to make me convert, then we're gonna fight. If the Recondite Order wants to come after me because I don't fit into their nice, neat little box of good and evil, I'll be happy to send them into the arms of their god and let him explain it to them. I don't disagree with you, Wynn. I'm just concerned about how they may see you. Some of them are rather rabid, especially the monks they send out on these kinds of missions, Joe told us. Sometimes they are willing to write off innocents who get hurt in their war. I shook my head and said, I don't do that, and I won't allow them to do it while I'm around, I said. I don't see where you have a lot of choice in the matter, Joe said. They've got training and weapons on their side. I have my resources. I won't let them hurt Eddie, Dot or Johnny, I told him seriously. And that statement seemed to have at least smoothed things out with Jimmy and George. After several moments of a long silence, I said, "Just remember, guys, if you see something with a cat's ears and tail, don't shoot at it. I'm on your side." "You seem to worry about getting shot at a lot," Jimmy commented. "Most bullets don't do more than sting. The problem is that when they start flying, people who aren't the target tend to get hit. A ton of were-tiger closing around people makes them panic and they start shooting wildly." "A ton?" Joe asked. "Well, 1,700 or so pounds. I could have said 7/8 of a ton, but that gets to be a mouthful," I told him. "But odds are that I won't be using that form. We'll be indoors and the ceilings are a little low, and for the most part it will be overkill." I let that sink in for a few moments before I said anything else. I wanted Joe to think long and hard about what kind of ally I would make and what kind of enemy. "Where do you think they'll be holding the guys?" Jimmy finally broke the silence. "Probably on the second floor. It'd be much harder for them to escape and it would put them away for their sleeping arrangements," I said. "What do you mean?" George asked. "Vampires usually nest in basements," Joe said. "It gives them an extra layer of protection from the sun, and most fires won't reach a basement." He stopped for a moment and said, "You have a knack for strategy, Win." "I've been trained by the best," I told him. "My mother was as Linda's fan with the Leif Erikson when he discovered North America." "Columbus discovered North America," George interjected. "Actually, no. Leif was the first European to land on the coast of what he named Vinland, 500 years before Columbus was born. And they continued to visit on occasion for the next 400 years or so," I said. "That's why there's runestones stretching from Minnesota to Oklahoma." "Just how old are you, Win?" George asked. "Me? I'll be 18 my next birthday," I told him. "And how old are your parents?" Jimmy asked. "Dad's in his 60s. Mum is well over 2,000 though. She's an elf," I told them. "Elf?" George asked. "Nordic elf, fae folk, that kind of thing," I said. "But you're not vulnerable to cold iron?" Joe asked. I shook my head and said, "Elves aren't elves, they're distant cousins. Remember, I crossed the cold iron bar on the door of your bookshop with no discomfort." Again, I wanted to remind him that I was not one of the bad guys. "This is going to take some getting used to," Joe said. "Answer me a question, Joe. Why the silver-plated sword cane?" I asked. He stopped and I could see a cloud pass over his face. And finally he said, "I had a disagreement with a werewolf during the Great War. After the war was over, I was approached by an associate member of the Order and given this cane. He's a judge in New England." "You've seen some other shifters in the past?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Actually, I've dealt with quite a few since I got back from Europe." "And yet, I don't act like any shifter you've ever met," I offered. "I give you that," he replied. "I still can't figure out where you fit into things." "That's okay, neither can we," George joked. Arriving at the road where Lucy lived, we found several Model A's parked along its shoulder. Men dressed in black were sitting quietly in their cars waiting, evidently for us. I pulled the Lascelles over to the side and Joe and I got out. I heard the rather distinct sounds of the bolts of Thompsons being pulled back echo through the night. "You fellas, wait here for a minute," I told George and Jimmy. And we were met by a large man in a black heavy woolen sweater and watch cap and black slacks. He was also wearing a heavy leather choker with little silver crosses all over it. It reminded me of the leather protectors the Marines used to wear as proof against garrotes. He looked first at me and I could see the scowl on his face, but was surprised when Joe got the same look. "Martin said this was your operation. What's this about hostages?" "They're holding 3 of my friends as bait," I told him. "I intend to get them back." "Why don't you stand back and watch, boy? You could get hurt dealing with the dark breed," he told me. "He goes, and I go as well," Joe said. The two men locked eyes and I could see a battle of wills taking place. And finally the man looked away and Joe just smiled. "I'm in charge here, Leon. Unless the kids have been turned, instruct your men that this is a rescue operation." Understood, Leon said. "Good. Now I know you don't like that, but here's something you're going to like even less. If it's got cat ears and a tail, you don't shoot it. You understand?" "I'm not going to let a dark breed walk away," he said. "It's not a dark breed," he told him. "It's an ally." "We don't make allies with the dark breed," Leon replied. "It's not a dark breed," Joe reiterated. "If it is not human, it's dark breed," Leon said. "And if it's dark breed, it dies." I put a hand on Joe's shoulder and asked, "Leon, do you want to keep your man alive?" "That's the plan, boy," he said, looking at me with disdain. "Then don't shoot at anything with cat's ears and a tail. If you do, you won't hurt it. Even with your silver rounds, you'll just make it angry. If you heard my friends trying to kill it, I promise you that none of your men will walk away from this alive." I told him pure and simple. "I don't take orders from boys," he said. I looked him up and down and finally said, "Okay, you've been warned." I turned to Joe and said, "I don't work well with stupid, and there are consequences to actions. They heard my friends, and the gloves are off. To be honest, I'm starting to wonder if I made the right decision bringing you and your friends in on this fight. It seems to me that your guys need a touch of professionalism." Joe just nodded as I walked off and found Jimmy and George getting out of the car, and they were being watched closely by several men dressed in the same way as Leon. I looked at Jimmy and George and asked, "What's the chance you guys leaving this to me and going back and waiting at my place?" "None," George said. "That's Eddie, Long John and Dot in there. We aren't leaving them to die, or worse." I nodded my head and reached behind the backseat of the LaSalle and pulled out the Thompson and a Colt 1911. "These are loaded. Shoot for the head. A 45 round may not kill a vampire, but it'll blow their brain case away, and it'll take them a while to recover. It'll give us a chance to get our friends out of there and disappear." Both boys nodded. George took the Colt and I raised an eyebrow at that. "Jimmy's dad had a Thompson. He knows how to use it." I raised the other eyebrow and smiled. "I'm going in ahead of everyone. You guys keep close to Joe." "How do you plan to get in?" they asked. I smiled again and slipped into the bushes. The same way I got my bag from the bushes last time. And then with a wink of an eye, I shifted down to my house cat form, and with a flick of my tail, I disappeared into the brush. The whole trip across the lawn I thought I was going to get shot at, but the order held their fire. I got the feeling, though, it was more the simple fact that they couldn't see me. As I reached the house, I looked up at a window high on the wall and cocked an ear. Soft voices were wafted on the breeze. "We have to get out of here. You heard what they said. They're going to kill us just as soon as they get Win and George," Dot was saying. "I'm open to suggestions," John was saying. "How about the window?" Eddie said. I suddenly saw a flash of his face reflected in it. "We're 3 stories up. The drop would kill us," John said. "We could use the bedsheets as rope," Eddie suggested. "Not long enough, and it would still leave one of us up here by themselves. We don't split up," Dot replied. Smart girl. Splitting the party is one of the dumbest things you can do at times like this. It lets the bad guys pick you off one by one. I went to the front porch and heard a low growl of the dog there. I locked eyes with him and growled again. I flowed up into my tiger form and watched him cower back. Then switching to my human form, I looked around and saw the startled expressions of the monks as they closed with the house. In the back I could see Joe and the others picking their way across the lawn. It was just a matter of time before someone inside saw them. Stepping back, I kicked the door in. and with a sound of splintering wood, it went flying halfway up the stairs. The twin roars of 2 shotgun blasts caught me full in the chest and stomach. I looked down at the tattered remains of my shirt before grinning over at the vampire holding the gun. I leapt at him, letting my body flow into its natural form, and with one hand I swept the gun away from him as I grabbed him around the throat, and with the other I bore him to the ground. As I straddled his chest, I grabbed the gun by the stock and drove the barrel, and then the forestock clean through his heart and into the floor below. Suddenly the room exploded with the sound of automatic .45 rounds. I felt them pepper across my skin and dig huge holes into the wooden walls of the building. So much for the order working with us. I leapt almost straight up to the 2nd floor balcony that overlooked the main room. Landing there, I scrambled over the railing and looked down the hall. And at the end closest to me, 3 vampires were pouring out at the nearest door on the right. At the far end there was a closed door where I heard a thud of something against it. It was time to take off the kid gloves. I flicked my wrist and said, "Vaxa!" and the axe began to grow in my hand. I looked around and decided a fire would be a bad idea in a wooden building. I swung the huge blade a couple of times and watched the vampires begin to slow, then crowd up and finally backpedal as I advanced on them with the axe. Like I said, there's a certain psychological advantage to coming at someone with an axe, even more than a sword. It screams, this is gonna hurt. A lot. In the tight quarters, I couldn't swing it with all my strength, and so my first swing was not what I would have liked. One of the vampires lunged in behind my swing, trying to bite at my throat. I guess nobody had yet taught him to first subdue his prey, and then bite. I had butted him hard across the bridge of his nose, and felt the bone and cartilage break under the force of my blow. Evidently those nerves were still working quite well, because he collapsed to the ground, holding his face in both hands. "He's 1 man, we are 3, the guy in the back yelled at me as he launched across the room, at the back of the middleman forcing the unfortunate vampire's face downwards. With a smile, I spun the axe with my wrist and brought its blade up and under the chin of the man who was bent over. Thunk! His head rolled to the floor and shattered into a dusty pile. As the man collapsed into a pile of dust, Mr. We Are 3 stumbled forward onto the pike at the end of the axe. Suddenly, a startled look came across his face. I grinned wickedly and said, "Eldrir!" I watched as the blade blazed to life, and the flame engulfed him from the inside. As soon as I was sure he was good and destroyed with, I whispered, "Stodva Brenner." The fire on the blade died away, and I looked around. I could hear more men come rushing through the front door, and again the sound of automatic weapon fire. Several rounds stitched neat holes through the hip of my slacks, up across my back and then along the wall to my left. I heard a thunk, and then a thud. Looking back down, I saw one of the Order's operatives lying on the floor, and George was picking up the Tommy gun the guy had dropped. He had what looked like an old-fashioned yard cop's leather sap in his hand, and as he picked up the gun, he smiled at me. I heard the sound of a struggle on the other side of the door at the end of the hall, and headed in that direction. I decided it would be best not to freak my friends if it was them, and so I shifted back to my human form as I reached the door. I was locked. I put my strength into it and yanked hard. The whole frame came out of the wall as I realized that it had been nailed shut. As I swung the door out and to the side, I was suddenly hit high, low and in the middle. I went down in a tangle of bodies as Eddie, Long John and Dot all tried to pummel me into submission with chair legs. When I finally got a handle on things, I swept Dot off me as she straddled my waist and was trying to drive the sharp end of the chair leg through my chest. "It's me, guys!" I yelled. "Win?" Dot asked as she scrambled towards me, holding the stake point first outward towards me, and there was an almost feral look in her eyes. "Yeah, Win," I said. "And they said they were going to kill you guys," Eddie said, rolling off my shoulders. "And they tried. I brought George and Jimmy and the cavalry," I told them. "Huh?" John asked. I guess in 1928 the tradition of cavalry coming over the hill to save the day hadn't quite made it into popular culture yet. "I brought help," I said as the wall behind us was suddenly stitched with silver .45 rounds. And that was it. I was tired of this crap. These guys were bound and determined to get me and my friends killed. I looked over at Dot, Johnny, Eddie, and asked, "Are there any more up here?" And they shrugged their shoulders, and Dot said, "We don't know." Slipping further down the hall, we checked each room, under the beds and even the closets. Nobody was there. All the while there were sounds of gunfire and fighting in the floors below us. I turned to them and said, "Okay, I'm going to go down and deal with our trigger-happy helpers. You guys keep your eyes peeled. As soon as it's clear, come on down." "What about you? Are they going to shoot at you?" Johnny asked. I turned and nodded, saying, "I certainly hope so." In a single bound, I made it to the end of the hall, where there were several of Leon's men charging up the stairs with their guns pointed at me. I began to shift into my tiger form and roared into the night, and then hit them full force. There's something about the frequency of a tiger roar. It can literally stun any creature. They weren't prepared, and so I hit them flat-footed. I heard the sounds of breaking bones as we tumbled down the first landing, where the stairs turned to the left. As we landed, I shifted back up into my natural form and grabbed two of the men. None too gentle, I tossed them back downstairs and through the wall separating the main room from what was evidently the kitchen. There was a thunderous crash as I reached down for the other two at my feet. I heard the sounds of new drum magazines clicking into place on the Thompsons. "Put 'em down," Leon growled at me. "I don't know what kind of shifter you are, but I'm betting that I can pump enough silver into you to take you down." I looked down and saw 5 men facing me with machine guns. Behind them, 4 more were holding a struggling Jimmy and George. I shook my head and said, "You'd lose." Still holding the 2 men in the air, their feet dangling a good 1.5 feet off the floor. I made my way down the stairs. "Go ahead, shoot me. You can fire all the silver you want at me, and all you'll do is kill your own men and make me angry." I stopped for a second, looked him dead in the eye, letting the tiger in my soul consume my eyes. "No, scratch that. I'm already angry. You just make me angrier," I growled. There was a dripping sound and a pungent odor that suddenly filled the air. I looked over to see where one of the men I was holding had lost control of his bodily functions. I grinned. One of the men must have been really nervous. And suddenly one of the Thompsons barked at me, and 3 bullets tore into my chest, and 2 more tore through the man who'd soiled himself. Leon screamed, "No!" But the others were panicky and suddenly unloaded their weapons on me and the men I was holding. I could feel the bullets slam into me, and one caught me high in the forehead. Well, that one hurt. I tossed the men that I was holding down the stairs and leapt. I hit the floor in front of the attackers, lashed out towards one of the guns. Grabbing it by the barrel, I used it as a club. 2 more men fell with one blow of the Thompson's butt caught the first one across the jaw and the second one upside the head. I casually side-kicked one whose gun I'd grabbed in the sternum and sent him through the exterior wall. I wasn't in the mood to be gentle. Like bee stings, I lashed out with both hands towards the guns. They let go and broke and run. "This is not what I signed up for. Let's get out of here, Jerry," the lead man said. As the second followed him, bolting for the busted door, he replied, "Sure thing, Joe. Back to writing for the funny papers." I looked over to see how Joe and George and Jimmy were. The 4 holding my friends had let go and were holding their hands over their heads and backing away. Joe had a Colt 1911 trained on them. "I told you what would happen if you guys couldn't follow orders, Leon," Joe said with a low growl of his own. "How many vampires did we get?" "I got 3 upstairs and it looked like Dot, and the crew got 2. That's not counting the one I staked with his own gun down here," I said. "3 in the kitchen," Leon said. "2 and downstairs," one of the men holding up his hands replied. "Anybody else see a redhead?" George asked. "Only him," one of the men with his arms up said. "He's one of the good guys," Joe said. "That's a matter of opinion," Leon said. I smiled and reached over and pulled a cross off Leon's neck and turned it over in my hand. "You really think so?" I asked. "That doesn't mean anything," he replied defiantly. I shook my head and said, "It doesn't matter. The point is that you seem to be more worried about taking me down, that you let a master vampire get away. I'd say you have some serious problems in enemy identification and setting priorities," I told him. "That's not a good trait for a hunter in this business. As far as I'm concerned, you become worse than the monsters you hunt." "Again, a matter of opinion," he growled at me. I looked over at Joe and asked, "What's the order likely to do if we let these 5 go?" Joe looked at me and said, "I can guarantee you that they won't be bothering you or yours anymore. After I file my report, Leon here is very likely to go back to Rome." I nodded and said, "Good." Turning to George and Jimmy, I added, "Dot and the others are upstairs. It looks like they're okay. You two bring them down. We'll check them over and go back to my place." "What about all the gunfire and the bodies?" George asked. "How do we explain it?" I fingered the axe on my wrist and said, "All died in a mysterious fire." When my friends came back down and we checked them over, I gave George my house key and sent them with Joe back to my place to wait. I went through the house from top to bottom, trying to find some trace of Lucy or any other vampires. Looking the place over, I came to realize something. She was fairly new at this thing, but evidently was a fast learner. She had several avenues of escape set up and a few crude booby traps, but most of them were obvious and easy to find. Most of all, she was highly intelligent and very dangerous. When I was sure that there was no sign of any more vampires, Leon gave me a strange look and said in his thick Italian accent, "You're actually very good at this, for one so young. My kind has been doing this for 8,000 years. 2 millennia before Moses wandered into the desert, we were hunting vampires, werewolves, and sorcerers who crossed the line and threatened mankind," I told him. "We really are on the same side." He shook his head and said, "That's not what the order tells us. Anybody with unusual gifts are dark breed." "Well, the order is wrong," I told him. "We can either be friends or we can go our separate ways." I stopped and looked at him. "But you're not going to kill me. I'm sorry, you just don't have what it takes. Maybe one of the others, but not anybody from my line, and especially not from Leaf's line." "There are more of you?" he asked. I nodded and lied. "I figured that I'd send them on a few wild goose chases," I told him. "There are 9 of us, all Magecats and all hunters of the night." He just nodded and continued with the work of covering the evidence of our fight with a subsequent fire. I have to admit, he was very good at that part. And that was my first encounter with the recondite order, and I can't say it was good. Over the next 80 years we came to an understanding, but outside of Joe, who became a good friend, we were never more than wary allies. It was also my first mission in that reality. Even though I almost lost 3 friends, compared to some of the things that would have happened later, it was a cakewalk. About 3 months later, I got an interesting letter. There was no return address, and the postmark was New York City, and it read, "Master Greenbow, you still owe me that dinner and conversation, and I do mean to collect. Although I suspect it might eventually be in a manner neither of us expect. I must say that you and I are probably both getting to understand our new situations much better. You are both a worthy adversary and a loyal friend. I find those rare traits among men today. I've learned a great deal from our encounter and look forward to when we next meet. Lucy Harker West." Wow. Absolutely wonderful, mysterious, enchanting and terrifying vampire story there from the incredibly talented and the incredibly supportive Wayne Harbison. Guys and girls, as ever, I hope you enjoyed this one as much as us, and please do take a second to check the link to Wayne's incredible Amazon store, where you can further support Wayne on his endeavours and adventures, and also purchase the Hunters Hunted series that I covered, and also the Shadows over Mobile Bay series that I covered as well. As ever though, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR. As ever guys, a huge thank you for all the kind words of support, the likes, the emails, the shares, the tweets. Sometimes it's very overwhelming and it's truly heartwarming to see such nice feedback and such nice warm comments and goodwill towards me and my family, and of course my associates that bring this magic to the channel week in, week out. I feel it's been a dark start to the year guys, but one thing is for sure, it's human nature. Where there is dark times, there is light at the end of the dark times, and we will all see good times ahead, I'm sure, by the end of this year. As ever, I hope you're all well and happy, but above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.